it speaks to providing services, and it insists that one must provide essentially power from the grid. And with all the discussion we've had about being carbon neutral by a certain date, I wondered whether it would not have been a good opportunity to provide an exemption where a development might not be required to have grid connections, but to be totally independent of the grid. With all the discussion about solar power and wind power and alternatives, we should have some provision for developments that are not required to be on the grid. There's a question of open spaces, and it is great to see that there are requirements for developments to have open spaces where adults and children in particular can safely play and frolic. And even within that section, there may be some omissions, because the onus for maintenance of these spaces, in my mind, seems to be particularly onerous on the developers, where the developer can maintain ownership, or it appears to my mind, being not a lawyer, that it can be transferred to the Crown, but yet the developer may be required to finance the upkeep of the said area. And I do not understand why, if the Crown takes over the development, this is section 48, why would developer be required to pay for its maintenance? Now, pardon? Well, there's that provision, but the other option is to transfer it to the Crown. And if it's transferred to the Crown, I think that the Crown should be responsible through I think it's the NCC for maintaining it, and the developer should not have to pay either upfront or make a plan that goes forward for maintaining it. It's a matter of environmental impact assessments, and while it is pretty clear that the town planner shall require environmental impact assessments, there is a beautiful escape clause where the minister may override that position. And Mr. President, remember, in recent times, there's been lots of talk about environmental impact assessments and when they're required and why they should be done. And I think it's important that while there's some developments that have an economic urgency to them, we should not be too quick to do not do the things that are right. Now, this bill also provides for protection for not animals but plants, and that doesn't only protect trees; it protects other plants. I remember almost 20 years ago on Pine Road, when Pine Road was being improved and pavements were being put in, there was a slaughter of the mahogany trees on Pine Road, starting on the northern side. And yes, some beautiful mahogany furniture was built from it. I can attest to that. And boats too. And I understood that the then Prime Minister intervened and stopped the slaughter and simply diverted the pavements around the mahoganies. And if you look towards the southern side of Pine Road, you'll notice that that diversion of the pavements exist. And I regarded it as a simple act of brilliance. It shifted the wall and made the pavement wider, and the trees remain. So now if you come down Pine Road from the north to south, you'll notice that the mahoganies are absent on the left, and as you go further south, they're still present. And we need to do this sort of thing. But more importantly, the Act speaks to replanting. And it's important to replant trees, not only because someone has broken the law and felled the trees, but also because reforestation and the planting of trees in developments is important. We can't just have concrete. Last but not least, Mr. President, I wondered if within this Act, and along the same lines of being carbon neutral, if it may not have been prudent to speak towards new developments having some percentage of their power being drawn from alternative energy. In the same way that we're required to have water storage tanks and cisterns for houses over a certain square footage, I wondered if we should not have seen provision for a percentage of the electrical energy to a home being mandated to be provided from maybe photovoltaic power or wind. With these few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Happy to recognize you, Senator Sack.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Honorable Chamber. I rise to lend my voice in support of this planning and development bill. The explanatory memorandum of this bill highlights a number of things, and I'm going to read them to you, to the Honorable Senate. The explanatory memorandum of this bill highlights that this bill will make provisions for the orderly and progressive development of land, the grant of permission to develop land, powers to regulate land usage, and the development and for other related matters. That is the explanatory memorandum of this bill. Now, these provisions might sound familiar to some of the honorable senators in this chamber. And the reason why it would sound familiar is because there currently exists a legislation which speaks and addresses these same issues. That legislation is called the Town and Country Planning Act. Now, the Town and Country Planning Act was enacted almost 50 years ago. It is still in existence. And we ask ourselves, well, why are we currently discussing a bill today which is dealing with the same issues that an act already exists and deals with? So in order to answer that burning question, you need to provide some context. Town and Country Planning Act, 50-year-old legislation. The powers at that time, in the 1960s, when that act was implemented, at that point in time, we borrowed the legislation from England. England had local authorities who had the power to deal with planning development. We ourselves did not have a local government. So because of that, we conferred that power to a government official. And that government official is the Chief Town Country Planner. He is the sole person who has the authority to make the determination on the applications, with the exception of the minister. That existing legislation is the current legislation that currently guides the regulatory basis in this country. Now, with that being said, and I've set the context as it relates to the vintage of the legislation, it then therefore would like to highlight the fact that the Act in itself was supposed to be efficient, and the Act was supposed to ensure that persons can have their applications dealt with in an efficient and fast time. I think the legislation spoke to the time period of being 2 months. And within that time period, it was supposed to be interdepartmental consultations, whereby all of that could be conducted, and the finished product, whereby the application would either be accepted or refused, would be furnished on the applicant within a 2-month period. That is what was on the existing legislation at that time. However, subsequent amendments saw the removal of that 2-month timeline, whereby now the chief town planner does not have to request permission from the applicant for the extension of the 2-month period. And that is one of the main reasons for the issues that we currently face under the existing legislation. That removal of the provision has created an area where now, once an application is before the chief town country planner, it can remain in limbo for an inordinate amount of time. They do not have to produce a decision within a 2-month period. They do not have to ask for permission to extend. That is one of the constant complaints that we have been hearing as it relates to town and country planning. The delay, the delay, the delay. Now, apart from the chief town planner, the legislation has also become a hindrance to doing business in Barbados. Now, according to the 2018 World Report Doing Business, Barbados was ranked at 132nd out of 190 countries. We were ranked at 132 out of 190 countries. That is a slippage of 15 positions from where we were in the previous report. And one of the major factors for that slippage circle back to the issue of the delay in which it takes to get a response on an application to the town and country planning. The report actually suggested that it takes approximately 15 months at any given time, complex application or uncomplex application, to be granted or refused, or for a decision to be made. A 15-month window. That is what the timelines suggest based on the report. Now, it is axiomatic based on that information alone, those few observations, because there are a number of issues with the Town and Country Planning Act, but just with those few observations, the date of the legislation, the timelines, the delay, that it is not easy doing business in Barbados as it relates to the current structure of the Town and Country Planning Act. Those few observations suggest to me that the existing legislation is outdated, it is inefficient in its process, it lacks transparency as the chief town country planner is responsible for the decisions, and it is a clear impediment to economic activity, economic growth, and dire need of investment. That is why I constantly stand here in this Honorable Senate and say time and time and time and time again that the Barbados Labour Party-led government is here to transform Barbados. That the Barbados Labour Party-led government is here to take us out of the last decade and bring us and project us into a 21st century Barbados. This bill is part of that transformative process. This bill is a step towards that direction. The drafters, when they decided to draft this bill, didn't just take a piece of paper, take instructions, and go and write down pen to paper and put words on a page for Senator Caswell and others to try and break it down. There were core principles that were embedded within the decision-making of this bill, within the drafting of this bill. Those principles were transparency and accountability, openness and inclusiveness, efficiency and effectiveness, sustainable development, and most importantly, in my personal view, that the bill was fit for purpose. So in pursuit of these goals, the bill has addressed a number of issues. I will not endeavor to highlight all of them, just the ones that are important to me as it relates to the administration and the ease of doing business in Barbados. As it relates to the administration, the existing act, as I highlighted to you before, has one person making the decisions, the Chief Town Country Planner. This bill now seeks to move away from that structure and create a new structure of governance, whereby rather than one person making decisions on an application, it is now before a table of 12. 12 persons.
Mr. President, a point of order. The senator is misleading the House. There are actually 15 people who make decisions, but they make them in the name of the Chief Town Planner. He doesn't make all the decisions. You see, and that is the thing that the government has been misleading the country about all the time. No one man does it. There are 15 planners who make decisions in the Town Planning Department today.
The legislation speaks to a board of 12 members.
He was inaccurate.
Yes, sir.
Your formulation is always motive, misleading. He was inaccurate. I take the point. Very well.
The legislation speaks to a 12-member board, and that is the number that I will stand by. I am a creature of instructions based on the bill before us, and the bill is clear. 12-member board. So rather than it being before 1, it is now before 12. The fact that it has now opened the doors for other persons, for other eyes to review the application, it reduces the issue of corruption, the perception of corruption. It now has more persons watching over each other. One man cannot operate on his own. This is not to suggest that the person who was initially making the decisions was indeed acting corrupt. This is dealing with the perception of corruption. And to further enhance it, it also deals with the issue of transparency and accountability. Because each of those persons, if there is indeed any apparent conflict, they must declare it. But this is so small that I might very well sit on that board, and I am here today with honorable senators that I may not have met prior to being in this position. And now that I am in that board now, and they come before me with an application, I have a duty to indicate whatever familiarity I have with them and let the board decide whether or not that would be deemed to be a conflict of interest or not. If so, I would remove myself from it. I could very well operate knowing within myself that I would not be biased, or I would not expose any, or I would not do any undue influence to the application and determining the application. However, because of the perceptions that exist, I would make a declaration and thereby remove myself from the process, thereby strengthening and restoring confidence and trust in the process which we are seeking to deal with today. As I said before, it deals with the transparency and accountability. Another aspect of transparency and accountability is the fact that each and every meeting now, when those 12 members sit and discuss, minutes are taken, the decision is highlighted and is documented. It is now within the law, within the bill, that those minutes should be published so that any general public can sit at home and go on the internet and read the minutes of a board meeting. He can now scrutinize it. That puts the board on their toes. That ensures that everything they do, they know that even with them, even though the decision lies with them, the public now has the opportunity to see what they have done, further enhancing the confidence and trust back into a country and back into a system that was once despised. And to top it off, you have your conflict of interest, you have your transparency, you have your accountability. The teeth have now been placed within this bill, whereby if a person is found guilty indirectly, if a person is found guilty for indirectly or directly being influenced to make a decision for reward, for financial reward or otherwise, or even just failing to declare a conflict of interest, they can now find themselves in prison, fined, or both. And the penalties are significant. the penalties are significant. We're not talking about $50 or the small amounts that may have been in this existing legislation. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. The actual fines can range from $100,000 to $250,000. That is substantial. That is a significant deterrent. That is restoring faith in a system. And that is what this government is trying to do. Rebuild and restore. Now, another issue that I highlighted in my introduction was the issue of the hindrance to investment. The true hindrance to investment lies in the delay that it takes for applications to turn out to be returned in the application process. The current practice, as I understand it, these were the words that the person described their experience to me. It is as though they enter a tunnel, continue to walk along this tunnel, no end in sight, and then a ray of light appears. And as soon as they head towards that light, it vanishes. And they continue along a dark tunnel with no end in sight until another glimmer of hope appears and vanishes. It becomes a cycle. So in other words, persons submit applications, they're either rejected or they're given conditions to satisfy. They receive the conditions, they go back, make amends, produce the new application or the revised application with the conditions being satisfied, only to be met with further conditions to be furnished on them. And the cycle continues and continues and continues. And then you ask yourself, well, why you didn't just tell me that in the beginning? Why not say to me up front, well, you need to do this, that, and the third, go and deal with all of these things, and come back so I don't have to waste your time and you don't have to waste mine. Simplistic. But that was not the practice, and that is not the practice right now in Barbados. We have a system where persons feel as though the goalpost is constantly shifting. Constantly shifting. They feel as though when they apply, their wait is in vain. 15 months, as I highlighted to you, is way too long in any given application. There may be some that might be shorter. There might be some that may be longer. I've heard in the other place persons mention 8 years. 8 years to wait on planning permission. That simply cannot be good enough in a 21st century Barbados. So this bill, seeking to address that concern, has reinforced timelines. Timeline. We need to operate on a timeline basis. Some may say this is theoretical, that, oh, well, if they can't do it within a 6-week period, a 2-month period that was on the existing legislation, how can they come and do it now within 6 weeks? The reason for that is because all hands need to be on that. There needs to be a structural and cultural change in the organization. We cannot do it alone. We can only legislate. And as I've heard constantly, we cannot legislate behavior. We all need to operate together. So this is a plea to the persons who are going to be assisting in the administration of this bill, which hopefully will become an act, that we all need to change the way we do business. The current trajectory that we are on will indicate that we will never be truly able to function on all cylinders. Persons, big business, that wants to come and invest in Barbados will not come and waste their time in Barbados if they're here to have to wait 15 months for an application. That means that the ground doesn't crack, so people don't get any construction work. It means that persons don't get to sell food outside of the construction site. It all has a trickle-down effect that affects our economic activity and growth. And if we don't recognize that and decide that we will work together to try to improve the functioning of this country, then we are all wasting our times. So as I stated to you, Mr. President, in the beginning, administration, timelines, delay. These are the few issues that I wanted to highlight as it relates to this bill. With the implementation or enactment of this bill, it changes the characteristic and the perception of our regulatory system. We will no longer be a hindrance to doing business. We will now be a facilitator. We will now encourage people to be wanting to come apply to the town and country planning, because they would now have the information up front. When you apply, and I think that these are the things that you need to do to satisfy your application, rather than refuse you and have you going back into the dark to come back shooting in the dark, you now know up front what you need to do to be able to secure your approval. That is a forward-thinking process. You cannot be deterring. We have to be facilitating and encouraging new business, because the current position that we're in right now, we need all business to operate in this country. And planning is part of that. Development and planning and use of land is part of that. So in closing, Mr. President, as I highlighted to you, I didn't intend to stand too long on my feet today to address this bill.
Take your time,
I didn't intend to stand too long on my feet to address this bill. So in closing to you, Mr. President, I am of the view that this bill has created a well-rounded system, that the applicants are now aware of their status. If they're not satisfied, it has created a tribunal where they can seek redress. If they don't receive a decision within the time frame, they can equally appeal it and go to the tribunal and find out what is the reason for the delay and seek redress. The bill exemplifies that this government is prepared and willing to improve the quality of delivery and services in this country, and its goal and its ultimate goal is really to have an ease of doing business. These few issues illustrate that this current bill is a vast improvement from the existing legislation that we're currently operating under. This bill is necessary and it is needed. And given our precarious situation, we need to get Barbados firing on all cylinders. We need to get all Barbadians willing to put their hand to the plow, and we need to change our work ethic mentally and culturally. With those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Senator Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. President. It always gives me great pleasure to follow my colleague, and I say my colleague openly, Senator Sands, because I find he brings such a warm enthusiasm to his speeches and for the support of the government's policies. And sometimes I find that he stands there speaking so lustily, and we want to encourage him, because that is the purpose of these debates. Set forth the government policy, defend the government policy, articulate and share the government policy. That is your mandate. From the independent perspective, we then have to balance this approach with that which is presented by the opposition. And indeed, if we were to believe the opposition this morning, the entire purpose of this legislation is to suit architects and to neuter the chief town planner and to provide for certain interest groups. So how do we find the balance? How do we find the balance between these two competing voices? Well, I believe, sir, that's the role of the independent senators. As we sit here and we listen to both sides and give what we believe to be our contribution for what is worth with regard to the legislation, with the aim of encouraging the discourse and seeing if through the process that we indulge in, that we can get to a place where we see each group being provided with the necessary satisfaction to achieve the ultimate objective, which is the good of the Barbadian people, sir. For my part, I think this is a very progressive piece of legislation, and the government should be commended for bringing it to the table as quickly as they have done, as well as for the consultation process that was utilized. However, again, I must echo the sentiments of the opposition leader of, well, Senator Franklin, in that the utilization of the standing orders and the ability to remove the timeline between the first reading and the second reading, I think, Mr. President, we can all agree it's becoming a bit of a norm. And I think, sir, that if that was the intention, well, we may find ourselves in a spot of trouble if we continue that as the modus operandi. So a word of caution, sir, we understand the necessity of getting certain bills forward, but there is some validity to the point which Senator Franklin continues to express. There is a reason and a mechanism and a purpose for allowing time to have discourse in between the first reading and the second reading to allow the arguments to be fully distilled. That being said, sir, I wish to draw to your attention certain clauses which I believe will have an impact on the public in terms of very positive, but also some suggestions, as always, with regard to areas the government could look at as they move forward with the implementation of the legislation. The first clause I would like to draw to the attention, sir, is clause 43, which speaks to a certificate being issued, and that's clause 43, certificate of lawful use or development. Now, sir, as a legal practitioner, you will be aware that one of the issues facing the conveyancers is when you are doing a requisition on title. One of the issues that arise, one of the issues which you find yourself having to deal with, and I am by no means an active conveyancer, but the members of my firm do take that role, sir. And one of the issues that you have to grapple with is the whole issue of whether or not there are any tongue and country matters affecting the land. This clause 43, sir, provides for the issuance of a certificate to put that to rest. Now, it will be something that will then, of course, be utilized and requested for, as it gives the assurance that the land is not subject to any enforcement notice, which, of course, is an issue if you're dealing with a conveyance or with a security. However, on a downside is that if the legislation makes the provision for this certificate, persons are going to ask for it. And if persons are asking for it, the resources need to be provided to the town planning department to allow them to issue it with the necessary speed. Because what will occur is that when the banks are doing the lending, the bank's lawyers will say, "Can I see your certificate of lawful use?" And if you aren't able to produce this certificate, because currently, as you will be aware, Mr. President, and Senator Tate and Senator Sands and the other, Senator Greenidge, of course, you normally rely on either an affidavit from the council on the other side or a response to the provision of the relevant planning development documentation. So now that you have the strength of a certificate of lawful use, my only caveat would be that persons will ask for it and resources need to be provided so that it is issued in a timely manner to allow transactions to go forward. Sir, moving on, the inclusion of a registry, I think, is a fantastic development. And that's at clause 98, sir. And this is, again, extremely important for persons involved in the transfer of land. And the register, as conceptualized, sir, says at clause 98 that the chief town planner shall compile and maintain registers of all applications for planning permissions, decisions on applications, planning obligations, notices of modifications, etc., 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 applications for consent, and most importantly, of course, enforcement notices and stop notices. That means, sir, that this register will now become part of what lawyers will search when they are investigating title. So again, the resources need to be provided to the chief town planner to allow the register to be kept up to date, almost akin to one of our other registries, sir. And the issue which will grapple, which our beloved Senator McConney will have to deal with, is how do we embrace the technology to allow this register to be kept up to date, and also for the register to be given the legal strength of a land or a court registry that a lawyer can say, I have some documentation from it expressly stating to the fact which I am relying on. Here is something from the Town and Country Registry saying that there's no enforcement notices. Now, Mr. President, the issue with that is, sir, imagine a lawyer goes and does a search and the registry is not updated on day X. He will be misled, sir, at best. And then imagine that lawyer advises his client and the client suffers a loss. The client then goes to Senator Tate, and the poor lawyer who was misled will have to go draw on the insurance. So these are the issues, sir, which the Chief Town Planner's Office or the relevant department will have to ensure that in utilizing the legislation, that the adequate resources are provided to ensure that its uptake is met with as little resistance as possible. Now, there was some mention by Senator Franklin in relation to Clause 44, which speaks to the persons who are allowed to draft, or what's the word, application for planning permission. This is Clause 44, sir. And that each application for planning permission shall be signed and stamped by a registered professional architect or civil engineer.
Page 62.
Page 62, sir. Clause 44.1. Now, I understand that there was some debate and discussion in the lower house as to the terms to be utilized in that regard. And I also understand that there is still some ongoing discussion as to the definition of engineer, sir. As Mr. President, you will be aware there are civil engineers, there are electrical engineers, there are mechanical engineers, and structural engineers. And each has a role to play, and each may be responsible for drafting specific types of plans. I understand that civil engineers deal with structural issues or immovables. However, there may be instances such as when you're dealing with breweries or electric grid systems where other engineers will be involved in the process. But I believe, sir, that this is something that could be rectified later on, but it was just something that caught my eye. But in looking at Clause 44, sir, and in addressing the concerns raised by Senator Franklin, and which were then addressed, I believe, by Senator Haynes in her response at the time on the point of order, sir, there is provision, as we see, for persons who are not registered professional architects or engineers. And Mr. President, you will notice there's civil engineer at the Clause 1 at 44.1, but then it reverts back to engineer at 44.3. I assume that will be rectified at the appropriate time. But Mr. President, sir, the concern is that we certainly should facilitate draftsmen or other persons with the necessary technical skills to do drawings on dwelling houses and duplex dwellings. But what was pointed out to me, sir, was that there is a liability attached when it's done by a professional architect or a civil engineer. However, there is no liability when we're dealing with draftsmen. So it does, however, raise the question of what happens in a circumstance when one of these persons does a structure which results in a failure. I think there needs to be some consideration as to how we keep it evenly keeled, and I don't believe that it should be something which we leave to later debate, if at all possible. So I just wanted to point that out for the benefit of the Senate, but maybe there's a purpose as to why it was left that way. But we do find ourselves with somewhat of a lack of equality situation, inequitable situation, seeing that certain persons are finding themselves, or maybe those persons have access to insurance. Whatever it is, it means that we now have a category of buildings or structures which will invariably contain the families, because it speaks to it being a dwelling house and duplex dwellings or buildings of not more than 2 stories, and these are normally what whole houses are, which there will be no liability with regard to the planning or the plans comply with the building code and building regulations in force, if any. Which, of course, Mr. President, leads to another problem in that there is no definition of building code and building force. But I believe building regulations, but I believe that another senator will be speaking on that issue, sir. It just warrants some form of discussion, Mr. President, and some incisive adjustment. But I believe the Law Review Commission or the necessary bodies that be would then have it within their mantle to determine it if it is not taken up here, sir. Sir, if you turn to clause 2F, clause 22F, sorry, my apologies, sir, you will see that there's a reference to, and that's at page 34, of a use class order. I have been unable to find the definition of what that order is, sir, and I would commend to the government side that I believe it.
Accurate about your page?
Page 34, sir, clause 22F. It says
34.
20F.
20F.
clause 20.
20F.
Subclause 2. Subclause 2F, page 34. It says, in the case of buildings or other land which are used for purpose or class specified in any use class order made by the minister under this section, the use thereof for any other purpose of the same class. I don't think it has been defined. I believe it will be, but for the purposes of the draft that we have, we would need to clarify that, I believe, when we get to the amendment stage, sir. Finally, sir, I wish to comment on the strength of the offenses set out at clause 103. They are quite impactful and I think would scare the most brazen fellow to steer the ship straight. When we look at the exposure of, if you look at clause 103, sir, at page 113 of $2,000 for each day of a summary conviction or a fine of $50,000. And then it goes up to $250,000 or to imprisonment for a term of 2 years or both. These are serious, serious consequences, sir. And we hope that they would encourage the necessary behavior to avoid their utilization. Again, though, it does beg that we consider the enforcement of it and, of course, the necessary effort to separate the sheep from the goats, sir. And, sir, with those few points, I wish to lend my support to the passage of this legislation, but would urge discourse on the issues that I have raised with regard to its implementation. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was actually still contemplating if to speak on the bill, but I will try to make a short but hopefully insightful contribution this afternoon. And I also just want to, before I start, thank Senator Boyce for, although brief but thorough, assessment of the details in the bill. Sir, the Planning and Development Bill is being characterized as a trigger or an instrument that is seeking to unlock economic growth in Barbados. And it's seeking to streamline and modernize the process as it relates to land development in this country. Mr. President, land is a scarce resource in Barbados. Second to people, I believe, it may be the most valuable in Barbados. We have, on this small little rock, 166 square miles, a population upwards, some estimates of 275,000 persons residing here in Barbados. And statistics show that we are the fourth most densely populated country in the Americas. So clearly then, land use planning is critical to our development. Mr. President, throughout the bill, and particularly in Part 3 of it, it speaks to a physical development plan. When I hear about a physical development plan, I believe it's a byproduct of an economic growth and sustainable development plan, because in my mind, that larger plan feeds into a physical development plan. Because, Mr. President, you cannot have the way in which you allocate your land resource disjointed from the way in which you are trying to chart the way forward for economic activity. Taking that into account, when we look at, for instance, something that's usually touted by the government, the investment that has come onto our shores, Ross University, they say, it's part and parcel of our economic growth strategy. And yes, it will bring economic activity into Barbados. But I often wonder if we forget the way in which it did come to Barbados. It was on the backdrop of the misfortunes of our neighbors in Dominica in the 2017 hurricane season. So to give the impression that the investment of Ross University was something that was aggressively done by government, and they had these plans and aspirations of educational tourism here in Barbados, I think sometimes it's a bit misleading. And I'll move on from that, because the point about Ross University is it was almost ad hoc, and then on the backdrop of that, we then had to find space for these persons to come into Barbados. When we increase economic activity like that, we then have to take into consideration that these students, the lecturers, and all of the facilities that go along with it will also place a greater demand on things like energy, water resources. They will generate waste. Have we accounted for those factors when we have these ad hoc introductions into our economic activity? So clearly from that example, we see how economic activity places demands on things such as energy and water, Mr. President. And this is where we have to find sustainable solutions to increasing economic activity. And the question then becomes things like, how do we reduce our fuel imports while maintaining or increasing the amount of energy that we generate here in Barbados? So for my own clarity and for the clarity of others here in the Senate, when I speak about an economic growth and sustainable development plan, I am speaking about a plan that spans approximately 20 years, just to be clear. And it is on the backdrop of having limited resources. And Mr. President, the decisions that we make now about our land use will have a direct impact on the future and what Barbados looks like physically going forward. For instance, I'll illustrate the point. If the government says we want to diversify the economy by increasing the contributions of agriculture and fisheries, right now, that sector contributes $100 million to GDP. GDP is $10 billion, so we're looking at 1%. We're moving that indicator of 1% to 10% in the next, say, 12 years. Mr. President, a scenario like that seeks that you have to look at how you physically allocate those resources. If you're talking about agriculture that is land-based, and you're talking about crop production, for instance, you're talking about considerations such as crop rotation, the proximity to watersheds, soil types, altitude, a whole host of biophysical and geospatial analysis that you would need to do when you're looking at land use planning if you're going to increase agricultural production. If on the flip side of that, you're talking about agricultural production that's related to aquaculture or hydroponics, is it a case that you're dedicating land specifically for large industrial type indoor facilities to have that type of economic activity to generate that target that you're looking for? Mr. President, if we're talking then for the instance of fisheries, the Ministry of Blue Economy has been instituted, and if they say, for instance, we want to have increased open water mariculture activities, because we want to increase our local production of seafood and fish on the island to reduce our vulnerabilities as it relates to food security. How do we then accommodate for something like that, given that we have only 2 major fish markets and they're located in very densely populated areas, Bridgetown and Oistins? And then how would we manage things like fish processing plants? Where would we put them? So these are the types of questions that come into my mind when I hear things like land use planning. So, sir, on the basis of that, I think sometimes we put the cart before the horse, because I understand that this bill today before us will be a lever of such to access investment coming in. But what type of investment do we want coming in? And does it get us to the point that we want to go in the future? That is the type of questions that I have as it relates to this bill. Mr. President, we say we're moving forward and we want to be fossil fuel free. So then my question when looking at land use planning and this bill becomes, where are we piloting microgrid technology as it relates to renewable energy, as Senator Maynard addressed earlier? Because if we're talking about using renewable energy, it has to be in the context of resilience. So when you're saying you're moving towards being fossil fuel free and you're transitioning to renewables, when you're looking at things like critical infrastructure like your hospital, your polyclinics, your police stations, even your pumping stations, are you then creating an environment where they are set in a stage that they can have a microgrid in the event that a disaster happens, they can be up and running quickly? So those are the types of conversations that I want to hear coming from the government as it relates to land use planning and development, Mr. President. Another point I would like to also make is that every decision that we make, in economics we call it opportunity cost. Every decision that you make, there's an opportunity cost attached to it. Because, for instance, when you grant a hotel the permission to be placed on one of your last existing mangroves, because you say it will create jobs, it will bring in investment into the country, and you destroy that natural habitat and that ecosystem, that was there freely available to you to protect you against things like coastal inundation, you have to ask if the value of the hotel destroying the mangrove is worth the money coming in, because then you have to borrow money to erect man-made structures to protect you from the coastal inundation. So for me, it's the conversation around the value of the economic activity and sometimes the damage that is done to the natural ecosystems and the future cost that is placed. And those are the types of things that I want to hear coming from the government when they're talking about land use planning, Mr. President. There's also a social element to it, which sometimes we take for granted. I know in the document, the bill it has, you're required now to have an environmental impact assessment. I've worked on a few of them, Mr. President, but I think it would have been prudent if they said you were required now to have a SEIA, a social environmental impact assessment. Because too many times, locals in this country find themselves being blocked off from public beaches because of how developers have erected structures along our coastlines, Mr. President. And if we are saying that we want to have inclusive growth and we want to have sustainable development, going forward, the government has to be very careful on how it manages the conflicts that happen when you put economic activity before social considerations, Mr. President. Moving on, sir, I want to draw the Chamber's attention to the country of Ethiopia. The country of Ethiopia. And I bring our attention to Ethiopia because in 2008, it was the fastest growing economy in the world. The top 10 fastest growing economies are actually found in Africa in 2018. But nonetheless, Ethiopia. 8.5% growth in 2018. And they have a document, Mr. President, because sometimes I think people think I'm a little crazy when I speak, but I'm not crazy, sir. A little eccentric, but not crazy, I can assure you. That country, which has the fastest growing economy in 2018, has a document called a Growth and Transformation Plan. 236 pages of how it intends to transform the country of Ethiopia. The document has its origin since 2010. It's going to be done in 3 phases. 2010 to 2015 was the first phase. 2015 to 2020 is the second phase of the transformation plan, Mr. President. And that document is quite detailed. So I'm not surprised that they were the fastest growing economy in 2018. That document has details such as the overall economic plan in it, Mr. President. It then has sectoral plans, which breaks down the way in which they plan to achieve a lot of hard targets. For instance, they have growth rates that they want to achieve in each and every sector that they have. They have the level of exports that they want to reach in each and every sector, the jobs created, and a host of social targets as well inside of that document. And inside of that document is also the infrastructural requirement to achieve those targets. When I compared that document to the Barbados Economic and Recovery Transformation Plan, BERT, I understand the government has to recover. That I acknowledge in all of its seriousness. But we have to be very careful when we say we have a growth plan. And when you look at the best practice, you are like years away in the type of policy decisions and the way in which you're making policy decisions from those persons who are excelling across the world. Because, sir, there's a strategic direction for each of those sectors. Along with that strategic direction are implementation strategies to ensure that when you evaluate after the time frame, you can know if you're reaching those hard targets that you've set for yourself. How many times have we been hearing in the last couple of years, we need to increase the amount of agriculture that we're producing in Barbados? But yet the industry continues to decline and decline and decline. Because in my opinion, I do not believe we have been serious in terms of the types of hard targets that we want to achieve and the strategies behind it and the infrastructure and technology that will take us to achieve those targets. So, sir, I think the bill is fine. Some of the details are questionable, but I won't get into that. And that is in relation to some of the comments that were made by Senator Franklin. But I think the broader context of the bill is, in my mind, what is important, because we had independence in 1966. And then at that point in history, there was a vision for Barbados. The government inherited, the current administration inherited the government in 2018. Given the way in which they came into office and the problems that they met, they were given an overwhelming majority in confidence, clearly. But I also believe that they now have the responsibility of rebirthing this country. I truly believe it. Because at this point in time, we almost are wiping the slate clean. And we're picking everything apart and trying to put it back together. But what I will always stand here and ask is, recover, Mr. President. Bring the legislative framework that allows you to trigger economic growth and development. But I'm also asking you to think a lot longer in terms of your planning. I know some of them might even say, we have the manifesto, that is a vision, that is what we want for Barbados. But I think that sometimes we politicize development in our small countries. And in doing that, we do more harm than good. Sound economic policy should not be politicized. Sustainable development within the context of an election cycle is a joke, Mr. President. When you talk about issues of resilience, for instance, I had a conversation with someone who said, at some point, small islands will have to, like Barbados, where most of your population is across the west and south coast. You may actually have to start considering moving a lot of your residential areas inland. And that is a conceptualization of looking 20 to 30 years ahead. A 5-year electoral cycle is a thing in the wind when we're talking about these types of issues. This is a long-term game that we're playing. So I'm saying to the chamber, let us not politicize good development. Let us not politicize the critical issues that are facing our country, Mr. President. Land use planning is going to be extremely vital, as we clearly have seen. But when we're making those types of decisions, don't do it at the expense of the future of this country. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Senator Tate, happy to recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as we debate the Planning and Development Bill 2019, I am one who, according to various stakeholders who would have contacted me, and my own reading of the legislation, it is indeed quite a comprehensive and definitely an improvement to the existing Town and Country Planning Act, Chapter 240 of the Laws of Barbados, and therefore the repeal referred to at Clause 106 is undoubtedly welcomed. Even so, sir, I too have some queries, concerns about certain clauses of the bill that I would like to raise in this honorable House for consideration and I hope action. My focus this afternoon, sir, will be on Clause 44, which is at page 62 of the bill. My honorable colleague, Senator Boyce, dealt with other aspects quite ably, and I will not seek to repeat any save and except those which he did not deal with in detail. Sir, with respect to Clause 44.2, that clause states that a registered professional architect or engineer who signs and stamps building plans included in an application for planning permission is liable for ensuring that such plans comply with the building code and building regulations in force, if any. Now, sir, we have a liability that has been imposed on a registered professional architect or engineer, and I don't have a difficulty with that liability. My concern is, and my question is, where are we with this building code and building regulations, sir? I have been advised by certain stakeholders that it does in fact exist, but that for right now they're being used more as guidelines than anything else because there's no building standards authority that can address issues of enforcement and non-compliance. So as we move forward into the future and we are trying to ensure proper land use and safe buildings and no repeats of loss of lives because of faulty structures, I would implore those that are in the requisite places of authority to focus on this building code and building regulations so that they will elevate to more than just guidelines, and so that the registered professional architects and engineers can in fact comply with the legislation by ensuring that plans comply with such building code and building regulations, and even more so important, and I notice it says if any, so if it's in the legislation as if any, it suggests to me that it's in a dubious place of existence because it says if any. It's in the bill saying if any. But if it exists and is working, it shouldn't be if any, sir. But whatever it is, if we are insisting on standards being raised, it needs to be focused upon, and whatever authority that needs to be in place to ensure compliance and, more importantly, enforcement. This ties in with was said by, I believe, Senator Boyce, with ensuring that that which is provided for in the bill will be properly implemented and enacted and enforced. So that's my only issue as it relates. It's not even an issue, it's just a concern, because I think I've been hearing about building code and building regulations as long as I've been practicing. And I know I don't look it, Mr. President, but this year will be a fairly long time that I've been practicing in October.
I hear it precedes you.
Yes, sir. Thankfully. Sir, I move on now to Clause 44.3. And the first line of that clause, as Senator Boyce mentioned, makes reference to a registered professional architect or engineer. And as he indicated, Clause 44.1, there was provision made for an amendment to include the word civil at the last line of Clause 44.1. So instead, as it was in the 2008 bill where it was just a registered professional architect or engineer, we now have it changed to civil engineer. Clause 44.3 reverts to engineer again. And my question is that intentional, or is it that there should have been an amendment to that subclause 3 as well to reflect a civil engineer as was done in subclause 1? Or, frankly, any other type of engineer? Because I'm hearing talk about structural, civil, electrical, mechanical. I'm not sure which one it should be, or is it that engineer is going to be defined in the interpretation section as any one of the above? But whatever it is, I would believe that there is need for some type of engineer when you are talking about building plans of a certain height with depth location. So that's my comment with respect to subclause 3, the first line. Sir, in relation to subclause 44.3b, it says, sir, if I may quote, a person who is not a registered professional, architect or engineer, may prepare and sign building plans submitted in an application for planning permission for B, buildings of not more than 2 stories containing more than 2 dwelling units, but less than 10 dwelling units. Now, I don't know what less than 10 is in our world, sir. That means 9. So I would have thought you would have said not more than 10. But even so, if one does not have an issue with semantics, the confusion I think that has arisen is because we have the legislation saying but less than 10 dwelling units. But in the January 27th, 2019 edition of the Sunday Sun, at what I believe is page 30A, the Honorable Prime Minister was quoted as saying that amendments will be made to the draft legislation to facilitate, and I quote, the ability of draftsmen to be able to continue to work on single dwelling houses and duplexes and up to 10 apartments. So I can't say she was quoted accurately because you know how it is. It's a newspaper, you don't know, it's in inverted commas. But whatever it is, it caused enough of a confusion for me to be contacted and requested to get it clarified. And to be quite frank, I would like to have it clarified too, because less than 10 is 9, up to 10 means 10. So is it what the legislation says? Is it what the Prime Minister says? Whatever it is, it would need to be clarified because there is a difference between less than 10 and up to 10. So I would ask that that be clarified, or a statement be made, or if it is what the legislation says, so be it. But it is interesting to note that this article would have come after it was passed in the House. So I'm just seeking clarity on less than 10 and up to 10 as referred to allegedly by the Honorable Prime Minister in the Sunday Sun last Sunday. And I believe that that would be of interest to those persons to whom that clause would refer, and I would therefore like either confirmation that it is in accordance with the legislation or in accordance with the pronouncement or the alleged pronouncement of the Honorable Prime Minister. Mr. President, as I move on, when I look, sir, at clause 44.3c, and that, sir, makes provision for commercial buildings of no more than 465 square meters in gross floor area and no more than 2 stories in height. It is my understanding that for those of us who are more accustomed to square footage, that 465 square meters is in fact 5,000 square feet, Mr. President. And my query is, and I really would like to have this explained, we have restriction in relation to gross floor area for commercial buildings, as well as 2 stories in height. And this, let me say again, is for persons who are not registered professional architects or engineers. So in relation to commercial buildings, they are restricted by floor area as well as 2 stories in height. But for buildings of not more than 2 stories, in relation to dwelling units, there's no restriction as to gross floor area. So my question is, what were the considerations that commercial buildings have a restriction for gross floor area but not dwelling units? I'm just curious to know why there would be both restrictions for commercial and only one restriction for dwelling units. And if I can help the House with the definition for a dwelling unit, it would be found in the interpretation clause 2 on page 14. A dwelling unit means a building or self-contained part of a building used or constructed or adapted to be used for human habitation by a single individual or household. Now, I am not by any means of any stretch anybody that can do anything to do with a plan. I was not very good even in art. But I'm curious to understand the rationale for limiting commercial building for non-professional architects or engineers, but not for dwelling units, because the way I see it, both of the type buildings will have inhuman beings. So what was the consideration for the restriction on the commercial side, but not for the dwelling unit side? If it's nothing magical, fine, but I'm just curious because it was stipulated, and it seemed a little curious for me that both the dwelling units and the commercial buildings for these categories of persons have the 2-story limit, but only one category had the gross floor area limit. So in that regard, I'd be grateful for some kind of clarification or some kind of explanation. Sir, with respect to clause 44.4, I note that basically that clause warns parties that the requisite regulatory approval must be obtained in order to, must be obtained in relation to the submission of building plans for approval, which I understand it. That's fine. But while I recognize that there are persons who are not registered professional architects or engineers who, the Prime Minister is very clear, must still be able to make a living, I believe that just as the government, by way of the proposed legislation, has insisted that the requisite regulatory approval must be obtained, that those persons who have the awesome task of drawing buildings and ensuring that they will not collapse, especially with people in them, ought to be regulated. And the public be given an opportunity, similarly to the architects, to go and see who is who, or similarly to the lawyers, in an official gazette. I believe they should be regulated because as I've been made to understand over the last few days, there is a difference between a technician, a technologist, and an art draftsman. Now, please understand, Mr. President, I am in no way trying to bash draftsmen. I know very capable. I have worked with a number of draftsmen, and there are good and excellent, well-qualified draftsmen in Barbados. The thing is, and what concerns me, and what I didn't know until we had to be dealing with this bill, is that perhaps even to their own detriment, there is no definition of draftsman anywhere in any legislation that I have been able to find that is related to this legislation today. So what that means is the only place they are referred to is in Chapter 373, which is the Profession, Trade, and Business Registration Act that all of us have in the schedule, not even in the body of the act, in Schedule 2. So all of us are named in there in some form or fashion who are professionals, but we are also governed by our own independent legislation, which determines what we're supposed to do, how, when, and I believe even in the Legal Profession Act, how we are supposed to dress for a court. Somber colors. So I cannot, members of the Honorable Opposition, wear red to court. No, I cannot. I cannot wear red. But we are governed by legislation independent of that piece of legislation, Chapter 373. Here it is now. We have legislation that allows persons to build up to or less than maybe 10, maybe 9 dwelling units. But and 2 stories, without requirement of an engineer. Unlike 3 stories and above, I'm made to understand where you must have an engineer. But there's no definition. There's no requirement for qualification. And basically, I can get up tomorrow morning and decide I want to be a draftsman. go to the requisite location, pay the fee, and when it comes to drawing this plan, I can draw a plan, submit it, and all I have to do is show my certificate of registration. There has to be something wrong with that. And I'm not trying to take bread out of anybody's mouth, but I encourage those persons that fall into the category of not professional architects registered, that they too look after their own interests, because it will mean that not only non-entities can come and say that they will draw, but we can be encouraging a deluge of persons from anywhere to come into this country, and because they're not held to any standard, start drawing. Now, of course, you will argue you're not going to have a draftsman or an architect that you're not going to want to see what they've done. But I'm different from anybody, because I want to hear from the person they did it for too. Because you could show me a house that looks very nice, and it could be the subject of a court case because of how it was built. But the fact remains, there ought to be regulation in terms of building in Barbados, whoever it is. And I am strongly of that view, and I encourage the powers that be to address that even as they increase. Because 10 units or 9 units is an increase from what it used to be. So if you are increasing and recognizing the value of the draftsmen and their contribution to the architectural landscape of the country, they also need to fall into a regulatory environment, not only for their own good, but for the good of those persons as an independent senator I look after, which would be the people of Barbados.
Unlike you.
I do strongly believe, no jokes aside though, that the proper draftsmen need to be protected and the public needs to be protected, and there needs to be a little more work in that area of regularizing anybody other than a registered professional architect or engineer that can get into the issue of the area of building, Mr. President. Mr. President, finally, it got me stuttering, Mr. President. Clause 44.5, sir. It jumped me. The Crown is exempt. Listen, look. The Crown is exempt are words that I don't know if I've ever seen anywhere in my life. But here we go. Any liability for negligence arising from the grant of planning permission for building operations under this act, meaning the Planning and Development Bill, whether the building plans submitted in application for planning permission were prepared by a registered professional architect or engineer or any other person. What confuses me, sir, right, is that these building plans for which the Crown will be exempt from liability, in order for there to be building plans upon which you act, they are going to be approved by a Crown agency, though. You can't build unless you get approval from the planning department. So how you getting approval from a department, and if there's a problem and there's negligence, the department that gave the approval will be exempt from liability, sir? Help me to understand. Help me to understand, Mr. President. That confused me. And you know, apart from that, if you had to have an unforeseen circumstance and a registered architect was at fault, they have professional indemnity insurance, they must. If you had it with an engineer, I believe they are required to have professional indemnity insurance. But if you have plans approved by a Crown agency, by a non-registered professional architect or engineer, because I ain't calling nobody name, I ain't picking on nobody, but if you are not required to have professional indemnity insurance, but you are allowed to submit plans that are approved, we have an issue because they are not going to have professional indemnity insurance because there's no category for them in the insurance arena. And that goes back to my point, there needs to be regulations so that they can go in and say, here, I am an architectural technologist. I have 20, 30 years of experience in working in an environment of architect. Go ahead and give me professional indemnity insurance. I'm just a little confused, sir, how the Crown will be exempt. And I believe that if this stays like this, it will be tested in the law courts for that same reason. The entity that has to give the approval is not a private entity. It is a public Crown entity. How are you given approval and the very same thing you approve can cause a problem and you are exempt? I am confused, Mr. President. I am confused. However, Mr. President, I am hopeful that we never have those unforeseen circumstances in Barbados and that will be looked at and that we never have to test it. And I'm looking at the fact that this legislation is to come into force by way of proclamation. So it is not due on the 1st of February. So there's time to address these and the issues highlighted by Senator Boyce and Senator Drakes and Senator Sands, Senator Maynard, and even myself, Mr. President. Some of these things, I would be bold to say, need to be looked at as Senator Drake said, in a non-partisan way, and in a manner where not because it didn't come from your side, you don't pay any money, Mr. President.
You also for non-partisan.
Was she very partisan?
I am of the view, and I would end with this, Mr. President, a well-drafted bill which becomes enacted only achieves its specific objectives. It is proper if it's properly implemented and managed. Let's hope that this bill, with the right intention, is clear. It is definitely an improvement of the old legislation. But let's hope that this bill will be more than rhetoric, Mr. President. I am so obliged to you, sir.
Are you supporting it?
You missed me beginning.
I now recognize Senator Greenidge.
Mr. President, thanks for recognizing me and giving me the opportunity to say a few words on this particular bill. Mr. President, from my experience in the other place, I have to admit that this particular topic, in fact, topics generally that have anything at all to do with town planning, the topic is not really what you would call a sexy topic. And therefore, you do not get a lot of people lining up and pushing their hands in the air saying, let me speak next.
That's the definition of sexy?
That is the definition of sexy. and even when they speak, sir, they go far and wide and even outside the topic of town planning. Now, to be truthful, I came here today and I had made some notes to pitch my contribution at a particular level. But when I heard Senator Franklin speak, no, it's nothing wrong about him at all. When I heard him speak, and he said that this particular legislation is aimed at promoting the minister at the expense of the employees of town planning, some of whom he represents. Then I decided that I would change the tone of my speech altogether. Not to bring it down at all. Not at all. In other words, sir, I will just look back at tongue planning and see what they have done in the past. And I begin, sir, by saying that this country, Barbados, is particularly grateful to persons such as the late Lenny St. Hill, Luther Bourne, and Mark Cummings. These were three of the best tongue planners you could want for any country. And these were very fearless. That fear is F-E-A-R. Very fearless, but fair. F-A-I-R. Tongue planners. And they brought a lot of teeth, a lot of respectability to the tongue planning department in Barbados. These, sir, were chief tongue planners who stood up to some of the most powerful czars and some of the most powerful politicians in this country. And they insisted that the conditions which were required by tongue planning were met, and that there would be no shortcuts, no matter who the person was. The other thing which I've noted, sir, about the tongue planning department is this. Well, first of all, you have places like the NCC, National Conservation Commission, where just a little less than a year ago, they were accused of having employees from one particular constituency sitting on top of one another at the NCC. We heard too that there was political interference at the National Housing Corporation, urban and rural development, a perennial thing. And I have to say, sir, that amidst all accusations of political preference and so on, the tongue planning department has been able to navigate through the complexities of Barbadian politics without being accused of having a political agenda. Tongue planning has never been the butt of major political controversy. Indeed, sir, tongue planning's bad name really came from delays. The bad name came from delays and not from political interference. Now, Mr. President, in an ideal world, legislation and development should always go hand in hand. But as you know, sir, this is not always possible. In a way, this bill before us is actually playing catch-up with the development. It is a piece of legislation which can be described as at-the-moment legislation. In other words, this is legislation for the times. We have assessed where we are with our development, and we want to put the legislation alongside the development. We've identified the weaknesses, and we're seeking, with this piece of legislation, to correct those weaknesses. Now, tongue planning, again, is easily, to me, one of the most maligned and vilified arms of government, and unjustifiably so. A lot of Barbadians see town planning as an annoyance, see that particular department as an annoyance. They see it, sir, as a nuisance. They see it as an irritant, a bother, and to keep back. And it is no surprise, sir, that a lot of Barbadians have actually attempted to flout town planning conditions, to flout town planning restrictions. And some of them have gone as far, sir, as to actually ignore the conditions and the restrictions, and you could even say to scorn them. The truth of the matter is that people hardly ever see town planning for what it really is. The Town Planning Department Act and the Town Planning Department itself, they have been extremely helpful to this country of ours. And so you have to ask yourself, but why then is there this amount of negative reaction by some Barbadians? You see, sir, invariably when the chief town planner is given his approval, he does so only if certain conditionalities are met. He gives you the conditions under which he will give that approval. You may have to construct a road, you may have to sink a well, you may have to remove a shed, and he tells you, unless you do those things within a prescribed time, you won't get the... And a lot of people see this as retarding progress. They see this as keeping them back. And you know, sir, in this country, we continue to aspire to be in an orderly society. And I have to say to the Senate that Town Planning Department has assisted us greatly in keeping order and in regularizing the way we construct our homes and also where we construct our homes. And we have to follow the rules. And without them, there would be something of a free-for-all attitude in Barbados. And we have to thank Town Planning for insisting on best practices in this country. That is what they do. They insist on best practices. We cannot allow persons to build houses on their own terms. It will not work. You know, sir, there are some persons who want to spend as little money as possible when they are building a home. And they want maybe just to say, I've built a home. And they may want to put what we call tarpaulin sheets on the roof, or a sheet of plywood on the roof. And the chief town planner will say to that, no, cannot happen, it will not work. And those people will see this as interfering with what is theirs. And they do not, as they've said already, see town planning for what it really is. Town planning there is simply insisting on safety and security for that home builder. Safety and security maybe against natural disasters. And people do not see this as part of the overall good. They see it as an annoyance. Sir, if you drive through Belmont Road and Bank Hall and Hinesbury Road, you'll notice that there are some people who have their steps, the house steps from the house, virtually in the road. Virtually in the road. There are some walls virtually not on, but in the road. In fact, there's one when you're going down Oyston Hill and you're going towards the fish market. Just before you get to the gas station there's a wall to the left as you go down that Oyston Hill. And on so many occasions, you find you have to stop and allow a vehicle to come the other direction because that wall is right there in the road. And sir, those houses and those walls were put there perhaps in the 1940s, 1950s, before there was a town planning department. And, excuse me, and the situation, sir, they're unregulated, they were unregulated. And the situation there is more dangerous than it is unsightly. Some children, little children perhaps playing in some of the houses that I've spoken about right beside the road with the steps. A marble rolls down the step or something and they go behind it. Anything can happen. And as you drive along, you can even push out your hand sometimes and shake the hand of someone in the house. You're that close to them. That close to them. I am saying, sir, thanks to town planning, you don't have that kind of building in Barbados any longer. Permission would not be given today by town planning for anyone to build a home so close to the road. The plan, sir, and the design of the house must be approved by the town planning department. We would want to build as we like, but thankfully there is a higher authority. No, sir, where those houses are concerned, the ones in the road that he spoke about, I personally believe that town planning's mandate should be to rectify what is wrong and what is bad. Never mind how long it was wrong or how long it was bad. Some of these owners have taken up every inch of space to the front of their property. And some of them still have endless space at the back of their house. And I am of the view that if you have room on your house spot, you should be made to take in your step or your wall, because the danger is always there. It is still there, whether you had built it years before or not. I know that we have turned a blind eye to it, but I do believe that if we can do something to rectify that situation today, then rectify it. Sir, there are some acts, including the Town Planning Act, which have served this country very well, but which are now in need of remodeling, updating, even repealing. And sometimes what we have to do is to get enabling legislation, different new legislation, in order to allow certain departments to function efficiently. One of the main features of this particular act, and many persons have spoken about it before, is that it puts in place a board, the Planning and Development Board, which will oversee the more elaborate and involved applications. And I would presume, sir, that these would be things like the Inland Hotel, things like the airport in St. Lucie, if that comes, things like the complex at Pickering, brewery, anything of that nature, anything that massive that this particular board would be involved in. And it is hoped, sir, that this board will help to fast track the elaborate projects. And sometimes delay can also cause you to lose a project. And I believe we have lost projects because of the delay at town planning. The board, as in particular, I think it was Senator Sands, pointed out very clearly that the board is also charged with the responsibility of informing applicants as to why permission for certain projects have been denied and what should be done to facilitate or gain approval. And yes. And as Senator Sands was saying, I made a note here, he says the board will tell you what you have to do. This board will have jurisdiction and authority and discretion in determining how worthwhile and how workable and how achievable these projects can be. And the question which I would ask is what any other person who is investing would ask. And it is whether or not the decision of that board is final and conclusive, or whether the board's decision is subject to review. And it is, because Section 35(1) puts it clearly that there is an appeals tribunal. And Part 11 explains how the tribunal operates. Now, this board, I have noted, does not seek in any way to new to the chief town planner. Applications, I do believe, relating to the simple dwelling house type will continue to await approval from the chief town planner. And I do believe that there is sufficient of that type of ongoing building construction of dwelling houses that can keep that department on full throttle. And so, Mr. President, virtually I've made one point, and that is that town planning department and legislation such as this have played a vitally important function in our development. I have no problem whatsoever with this bill, sir, and it has my full support. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr.
And before you start,
President. I rise to lend my voice to this debate and to give my full support to this bill. I would have mentioned in this honorable chamber that I've noticed a trend in the type of legislation that is finding itself through this honorable chamber. In every aspect, in every case, the terms transparency and accountability are present. And this bill, just like previous bills that we have debated, seeks to bring a greater sense of transparency and accountability to town and country planning in this country. My main focus this afternoon is to look at an aspect of this bill that I believe, just like Senator Greenidge had alluded to, would not be considered a sexy aspect of it, in the sense that it did not generate a lot of discussion, but I think it's important that we talk about it in this place. And it has to do with Part 6 of the legislation, Clause 52. Part 6 looks at the protection of cultural and natural heritage. And I don't think that enough discussion is taking place, enough discussion about the importance of our built heritage, especially in this country, and the preservation of our built heritage. Now, there are some among us who would argue that many of these relics of our past are now irrelevant. They have no practical use in a modern 21st century forward-leaning, forward-thinking Barbados. But I would tend to disagree, because these relics of our past, these monuments, these buildings, they connect us to our past. They connect us to who we are. And they tell a story, each and every one of them, about the struggles, the aspirations, the dreams of our forefathers. And for that reason, if no other, I think they are worthy of preservation. To see that this particular bill has, by the increasing or the strengthening of fines, made steps to ensure that persons do not destroy our built heritage. Because it has been happening. Now, Senator Wiggins would have alluded to the garrison and its environs. Of course, those types of buildings will be preserved. They're in the public eye, we see them, but there are other smaller buildings, smaller dwellings. And Senator Walcott would have referenced vernacular architecture. Vernacular architecture, which for those who are not familiar with that kind of terminology, will refer to those houses that that were built using whatever materials were available to our forefathers, to our grandparents. The chattel houses and the other ones that are built of a little bit of wood and a little bit of stone and such like, versus the polite type of architecture that we are seeing in Barbados today, where you have that what the Americans refer to as cookie cutter type houses being built. Very polite architecture, very neat, very proper, versus how it was where you get a piece of land someplace, you build a house. You build it with galvanized if you had galvanized. If you had cardboard, you use cardboard. If you were lucky to be able to afford stone, you use stone. But many of those homes are still with us, but they're disappearing from the landscape, and they're disappearing quickly. And I think, especially as it relates to emergency listing and the increasing the fines, that will go a long way in preventing persons from going in the dead of night under the cover of darkness and pushing down some of these properties. I remember as a child in the community where I lived, there was what you call a slave hut. It was there. It was next to the road on a piece of property. For years I would pass there and I was fascinated by it, to be honest. And one day, like that week passed and all we saw was rubble. And that had to be about 25, 30 years ago. And to this day, the only thing on that land is a lawn. Not even a lawn, some grass. I saw some sheep there a few weeks ago. It's not being used for anything productive, meaning that the person saw no value in the property. In fact, to their eyes, and I imagine to other person's eyes, it would have been an eyesore, because they did not appreciate the cultural value of that piece of property, the story
the history of that piece of property. And I think, too, were the person aware that there was such a fine. I see numbers here. Let me just quote. For the demolition, or these buildings are listed, and I believe that a lot more buildings should be listed, especially if they are seen as historical monuments. But persons listed or not, persons were still inclined to go out and destroy these buildings. But in this particular piece of legislation, under Clause 54, subclause 3, it says that subject to subsection 4, a person who executes or causes to be executed any work for the demolition or alteration of a listed building, monument, or the disturbance of a listed site for which the board has not granted prior planning permission, or is in breach of any condition subject to which the board granted such permission, is guilty of an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $500,000. I think it should be more. Because when you destroy these buildings, there's no going back. There's no going back. That part of your history is gone forever. And another thing that I've noticed as well, and persons who have the means to do so, persons who go into areas, come into this country, going to areas, I can think of a place in the north. There are historic buildings, a lot of historic buildings in the north, in Spikestown, in the north of Barbados. You have some structures down there. Now, I've noticed over the years, they would take the buildings, they are listed, so they cannot make any alterations, so they cannot demolish them. But they just allow the building to just stand there and run to ruin and rot away, which I think is just as egregious, to allow buildings that are of historical significance to just stay and rot away, just so they will have an excuse at some point, perhaps under the guise as some kind of health hazard, then to go in later on and demolish that building and proceed with the development that they had in mind from before. But as I said, these things are not important to everyone, but I think they should be, because they speak to who we are as a people. Who we are as a people. And any piece of legislation that looks at that type of preservation of built heritage, and not only those well-known places, but the unknown places that are out there that still remain on the landscape, I would gladly throw my support. But I think a little bit more needs to be done to ensure that all these properties are found and listed, so we can preserve that aspect of us. Another thing I want to look at too is the conservation of green spaces. And Senator Walker would have mentioned that it is almost the culture in Barbados to clear away. We have this fascination with concrete. Fascination with concrete. When I was a child growing up in the country, and I am from the country, I'm very country. I'm sure that is obvious to many. We had very rustic, yeah, very organic. I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed. All right? Very organic. We grew up around dumps trees and guava trees, number of trees, right? A lot of these trees, you ask a 10-year-old would not be able to identify because they were cleared from the landscape. In fact, I had a cabinet minister visit St. Andrew over the weekend, and she was fascinated by the amount of fruit trees and vegetation still. Did you wear pick some fingers, she told me? Yeah, she came from St. Philip, as a matter of fact. Really? From St. Philip. Very surprised. But we need to preserve these green areas. And a lot of people don't know this, but I actually wrote a book on medicinal plants and the use of medicinal plants in Barbados. We had some of that too. And one of the things I discovered when I was compiling the research for that book is that a lot of words would have disappeared from the landscape, from the linguistic landscape or the lexicon of Barbados. A lot of terminology, a lot of terms as it relates to folk medicine. And the reason a lot of these words would have disappeared was because a lot of the plants that are associated with those words disappeared from the landscape. In fact, it took me years of not seeing what we call lantana or governor's ball. That plant that I would have seen as a child all over the place growing. I've not seen it. I mean, yes, it's called that too. You can find it in parts of Barbados, but because so much of the landscape has been disturbed. There are plants, and not just one, but there are many plants that have disappeared from the landscape of Barbados. And I think an effort should be made to reintroduce some of these plant types, these plants, to Barbados. Yes, we protect the trees, the older trees. Permission must be granted to cut down a tree, certain size, certain age. But a lot of these little brush, these little plants that we see that we never take notice of anymore, because perhaps in this modern Barbados, there's little need for medicinal plants like in the past. Of course, I noticed maybe starting from the 90s, a move towards a return to the use of natural remedies, and persons are now looking to alternatives to Western medicine. But the unfortunate thing about it is that you can't find the plants anywhere. You can't find them anywhere. So they're not even in gullies, you can't find them. And because of the plant, not every plant will grow in a gully because a gully is damp. Some plants grow out in the open. But in Barbados, we have taken to pushing away all the greenery, all the grasslands, all the bush, all the trees. There's almost very little regard for trees in this country now. And I think before it's too late and we lose, and I don't think, I've never heard of any study being undertaken where, I'm not saying that there has not been a study, but I'm not aware of some of the lesser known plants in Barbados that have disappeared from the landscape. And there are many. Believe me, there are. But something needs to be done about that. And I can think of another occasion where we have the opportunity to speak to it, other than speaking to this bill. And though when we think about town and country planning, we usually think about the town aspect of it, the cityscapes, and the planning of the laying out of the city. But we must be very conscious of the fact that in the country, there's even more devastation in terms of our natural environment taking place. Not only along the coastlines. Yes, there's that, but within the rural areas of Barbados, a lot of our plant life is disappearing. A lot of our plants and natural vegetation is disappearing. And I'm comfortable with what this legislation seeks to do in terms of imposing greater fines on persons who deliberately go out there and remove and destroy the landscape before permission, but I still think a little bit more needs to be done in terms of preserving some of our plants. So I will end, as I started, by saying that I support this bill. I support what it is doing for the average person in this broader sense. I'm moved by the words of Senator Wiggins when she said that over the years, persons going to town and country planning to apply for a permit often had to be familiar with somebody in there in order to get it done in a timely fashion. And that's true. Senator Franklin would have alluded to all kinds of corruption and such like in that place. I would try to give this honorable chamber the impression that that started on May 24th, but I know for years, at least 10 years, that town country plan was used almost as a tool to victimize people in Barbados, poor people in Barbados. Of course, if you had money, you could build large warehouses if you want to, but a poor man, push down in a flash, man. Build their shopping next to your house, push down. So I know that this corruption that you alluded to didn't start 8 months ago. It didn't. But, as I said, the hallmark of this administration going forward, and this is further evidence of that, will be transparency and accountability. Transparency and accountability. And the people of Barbados will have us to judge. Because people of Barbados would know that there's now greater parity between the haves and the haves not. That anyone could walk into town country planning and apply, and if they refuse, they have recourse. Real recourse. And that's something that is novel to us. Believe me, I've been there. So with those few words, Mr. Chairman, I want to associate myself with the sentiments of the senators who would have supported this bill, and once again pledge my full support to this bill. I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Springer. Yeah.
Yes. Senator Rogers, happy to recognize you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to make a brief submission on this bill. First, by commending the government for bringing it to us. I believe that all of us in this honorable chamber have noticed the ferocity of weather systems in the past few years. I believe everybody in the world, save one, would acknowledge that there is such a thing as global warming. And the dangers that it presents to us at this time. So this bill is indeed very timely, and I believe that we should pay close attention to not only what we build, but how we build and where we build. And I wish to agree with Senator Drakes that a bill such as this and a plan such as this requires probably decades to put into place. But as she also alluded to, our electoral cycles give us the luxury of only making 5-year plans. And so many are caught in that cycle. But I tend to believe that from what I'm hearing today, we're thinking much beyond the 5-year cycle. I wish to thank the honorable members who have spoken on this for the insight that they've offered thus far, and also the areas in the bill that they've pointed out that may need some rethinking and may need some amendment, and I pray that we will pay close attention to that as well. But I wish to thank particularly Senator Drakes and Senator Springer for their submissions, because they would have touched on some areas that I wish to touch on, and that is the social impact of this bill. I believe Senator Drakes mentioned placing a hotel on our last mangrove site, and it reminds me of a composition of a calypso I heard several years ago, which was sung by none other than our current Minister of Culture, These Fields and Hills, which said, we never should have sell to all-inclusive posh hotels, beachfront with high and low tide, while Bajans only get in pond side. You have to know what is happening in the belly of the society, Senator. And the area I wish to particularly focus on is Section 6. our cultural and heritage development. When we speak of culture, we speak of our way of life, the way we live and move and have our being, the things that define us. In another place, I like to refer to it as the soul of the nation, that thing that drives us, that thing that connects us all to each other and connects us to this land. Our culture tells our history. It tells us something about our development. And our buildings are very important. I'm sure that we've all traveled to places in the world and we've admired the architecture. We've admired what would have shaped those nations, sometimes buildings that are centuries old. We too here have some old buildings that I believe we need to pay very special attention to. Strange enough, just last night, my little daughter Sophia was reminding me of every time I pass Gemmett's Lane, I long to see the restoration of those buildings. I know that there was a fire there recently, and perhaps our engineers will have to tell us whether it's possible to restore those or not. But also the one at the end of the road there that I believe was the old welfare building. I think persons told me that's what it was. The one with the lovely curvatures and so on. The old I ward, sorry. To see something like that restored would be really beautiful in this land. But it also speaks to our national development in terms of heritage tourism. I think we have long recognized that Barbados is not the only place that has sea, sun, sand, and some other things that people add that I do not know about. There are many places offering those things. But what we have is a unique heritage. We have a unique heritage in the sense that the British not only colonized Barbados, they called it home. And they sought to build structures that replicated what they had over there. And so we have a rich history in our old buildings. And we have seen examples of how they can be restored. Indeed, the very building we're in right now tells us that these buildings can be restored in an immaculate way and speak to the history and the heritage of our land. It would be remiss of me if I stood here and didn't make the point that the institution to which I belong, perhaps second to government, controls some of the oldest buildings in this island. Some of them over 200 years old. Indeed, the parish of which I am currently the rector, its church building is the oldest ecclesiastical building on the island. We're observing 235 years this year. It's only the oldest because it was the only one of among 6 buildings that survived the devastating hurricane of 1830. And so the building itself is that old. The rectory which we just restored is 179 years this year. St. Luke Church, where I served before, is 189 years this year. And there are many others like that. St. Luke would have been a part of what we refer to as the Coleridge Chapels of Ease. So there will be St. Matthew and Holy Trinity and Holy Cross and all the others that would be around that age. They may not have great architectural value, but they're part of our heritage in that these buildings were the centers of the community where they existed. And many persons would have been nurtured through the walls of these buildings and through the ministry that would have been offered there. Indeed, at St. Luke, the Church Lads and Church Girls Brigade, which is still in existence today, was founded in 1899. This is 120 years this year. And many persons would have been nurtured through that institution. I've said that to say that these buildings have affected in a positive way, and in no small way, the social landscape of this land. But as we always joke when we sit together as priests, that when you become an Anglican priest or a rector in Barbados, you're not only a minister of religion, you're a minister of works. Because these old buildings require maintenance. And I'm happy to see that we're here talking about heritage and our buildings. I was a little scared when I saw clause 54.3 on page, just let me get the page, 72, which spoke about executing work that is not in keeping with the planning department, because as church members would know, our funds are limited, and we may decide to have a men's fellowship project where the men come together, mix a little cement, the women cook a little food, and we do a little fix-up. But it may not be in keeping with I'm just saying what traditionally happened. If you want to come and mix concrete, we gladly welcome you. Sorry, Mr. President. I've said that to say that I was a little scared, but I was happy to see 53.4, which says that in matters of urgency, you can do your own thing. But I would like us to do proper preservation of these buildings. And whereas in clause 56.2, it says that the board shall, as far as practicable, assist owners and occupiers of listed buildings, monuments, and sites in procuring financial and technical assistance for the purposes of conservation and rehabilitation of such buildings, monuments, and sites. I commend that clause, but I wish for us to even take it a little further. I think that there should be something more concrete here, where perhaps the government either provides some fund from which owners of these buildings can get special credit terms, or some facility where we can get special credit terms to properly restore these buildings. It is very important, if we're going to talk about our heritage, and if we're going to talk about the restoration of our buildings, I would like us to have something even more concrete in terms of getting credit. The importance of this is that, and I'm not only speaking of the church, I'm speaking of all owners of buildings. We have been disestablished. We're not seeking grants. We're just seeking better credit terms. It was Karl Marx who says, if you take away a nation's heritage, they are more easily persuaded. And when we look around our country and see what is happening to our monuments even now, it suggests that there's a disconnect with our heritage as Barbadians. The mere fact that we have to find one of the heads of the 3 W's at UWI, and more often than not, we have problems with the Clement Payne bust and all the other things that are happening around us. It says something that there's a disconnect where our people are concerned. If we want to restore the soul of this nation, we have to pay close attention to our heritage, because there's a spiritual connection between buildings of the past and current generations. in one of our hymns in church, hymn 689, I also know hymn, Senator. In hymn 689, when we remember past worshipers, there's one stanza that says, "These stones that have echoed their praises are holy, and there is the ground where their feet have once trod. Yet here they confess they were strangers and pilgrims, while still they were seeking the city of God." When we sing that hymn, we are really connecting with the praise of those who have gone before us, as though they were still there, as though these walls still held those praises. In the same way that when we come into this place and we sit in these seats, I'm sure that most of us would have thought, I wonder who sat here before, or who walked these halls before. And they inspire us to do the best we possibly can for the development of this nation. Imagine what can happen if we seek in a positive way and in a determined way to restore the heritage of this land. So once again, I wish to thank the government for bringing this bill, and I encourage us to pay close attention to Section 6 as we seek to restore the heritage of this land. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to make my contribution to this debate regarding this Planning and Development Act. And I have to say that there's no doubt that changes to the planning legislation has been long overdue. In fact, when you think about it, Barbados really now lags behind most of the other Caribbean islands in terms of their planning legislation. And apart from the fact that it's, as was mentioned by Senator Sands, as is now the current act is now over 50 years, or just about over 50 years old. There were obviously defects in the legislation that needed to be remedied. The last major upgrade that I have been aware of was back in 1970. So it was really crying out for change. The current issues, as we have heard mentioned around the table already today, in terms of the administration of Town Planning Act, were largely things like efficiency, transparency, and inclusion. And so it is to be highly commended that the government has brought a bill which makes a number of changes to the legislation to address the areas of transparency and to allow greater public involvement in development control. And of course, another important aspect of as well is allowing non-applicants to have a voice in the overall processing of applications. Some good things, and again, for commendation, is including the requirement for the environmental impact assessment in the process. Something which we heard and which was talked about in the past, but it was not really something which was embedded in legislation. And in fact, it is now part of the legislation. Also embedding the implementation of a building code. Again, I've heard a lot about this. I think I can think of one particular engineer who has been for quite a while calling for this building code to be in place. And so it is adding teeth to the enforcement process, as well through, of course, the imposing of some very severe fines for breaches in the legislation. Some of them, again, were mentioned earlier. So there are quite some good things about this legislation, and I commend the government for taking the bold step of not just making amendments or tinkering with the old legislation, but we're a completely new framework in which to carry out the planning process. Of course, there's always issues in any new bit of legislation, in any bill, in any amendment, which we can have differences of opinion on. And there are just a few some aspects of this legislation where I am not yet convinced in my own mind that they're making the order, they're going to make the kind of progress which I inferred or which is expected to come from this new legislation. Just to mention a few of those areas, of course, recognize that a major change is the removal of chief town plan from the decision-making process directly forward. It's not come out forward. The process is now being guided by board. And the town plan has been regulated, I should say, to the secretary of board. So the decision-making process now to the board, who, as we have heard, if board soldiers can delegate some of us to the chief of plan. The chief of plan has not even further delegated his own staff unless he has and gets permission from the board. So I am wondering if this creates a problem, if it will create a problem in terms of the day-to-day administration, running, and management of the town planning department. If every time the chief makes the administrative or some decision as force of a commission board. Of course, there are a number of decisions which are not even delegated to the chief town plan. The minister, of course, retains a regulation which allows the minister to call for applications individually and class development. So anyway, this really works out the decision-making process back in the hands of the minister, who by way of the majority of the board. And Mr. President, the discussion for a long time is more equipped to make that decisions. Is the federal of politicians. As certain introduction of between Mr. Board that we and I don't have any objections to the board is not you in some legislation, so I don't have any big problems with that. But the thing that in establishment board that the person who wants to be have a professional in both areas. Serious we need to have more it could be reported, and that is what, incidentally, you would not think that that would be necessary in a place like the UK, but that is actually what the tribunal in the UK does. So, my point on all of these is that I'm not so sure that every aspect of this bill will actually improve the process. In fact, it may complicate the planning process, but we shall see how it works. In section 54.3, Mr. President, the term disturbance of a listed site is mentioned, and this is in relation to heritage sites, which was raised a while ago by Senator Rogers. But to my mind, that is really too vague, and there's no definition of it in the terms of in the definitions. So I would really like to see, and I think it is necessary to have a clear understanding and definition of what this disturbance of a listed site is. After all, you can be fined $500,000 or 10 years or both if you disturb one of these heritage sites. Now, and we don't know what what a disturbance means. Do I build, if I go and do some landscaping on the property or something like that, is that a disturbance of the heritage site? So, so I think that, Mr. President, definitely needs proper definition in legislation. The requirement, I think, that additional information on applications be made only once is good in principle. I have no problem with that. My only question is, if the town planner requires some additional information in doing his research and so on, and then it goes to the board and the board requires some additional information, what happens? Not only that, But out of the additional information could very well come additional questions or additional queries or additional concerns. So how do you get around that? And so that may need also a little addressing as well. Environmental impact assessment I mentioned earlier, I touched on earlier, a necessary and very good step. It was certainly a deficiency in the current legislation, as we mentioned, so it is good to see that that has been tidied up and that has now embedded clearly in the legislation. There's just one little thing I would mention though, because if you think about in heritage sites, if you're going to do any developments, if you're going to do any renovations, anything to properties in heritage sites, it says if you look in the schedule, I believe it's the third or the fourth schedule, an environmental impact assessment is required. Now I think that may not be necessary in every case. There are some small buildings, houses, which still exist in some of those heritage areas. And so I would somehow think that to require, someone with a little shop or something to have to do an environmental impact assessment in order to be able to do some renovations in that kind of situation is probably is burdensome and really probably over the top. And while I'm on that as well, just one other little thing. It did mention also environmental impact assessment required for crematoria and funeral and funeral parlors, and it would suggest cemeteries should therefore naturally be added to that requirement as well. Another good aspect is that the new legislation, of course, gives third parties the right to object and to have a hearing at applications. So that is what I was talking about when I talk about broadening the scope of public involvement. And that is a new, again, that doesn't exist, of course, in the current legislation. And that is in keeping us as well with modern practices. I would only suggest, though, that we have to be careful, and I think that the regulations or whatever should be of such that you don't have busybodies, I suppose, for want of a better definition, or people who just want to frustrate a process to be in a position to have a say in the process. That in itself can, if not properly managed, that is correct, it can actually retard or delay the whole planning process. So I think that has to be managed, and what I'm suggesting is that there should be clear regulations as to areas in which these third parties can object or will have a right to object to these particular applications. And finally, Mr. President, just one other little thing I want to mention. I believe it may have been, I think I may have heard it already, but I wanted to emphasize it, and this is the provision requiring that all open spaces in residential developments must be now transferred to a body corporate of the residents, or failing that, it must be transferred to the government without compensation. And That is a bit harsh. That is a bit harsh because you're now requiring the developer to give up lands for free. But almost like adding insult to injury, having required that, having put in that requirement, you then go on to make it necessary and make it incumbent on the developer, having give up the right of ownership to that land to maintain it. And that can't be right. And it doesn't say to maintain that lot for a year or 2 years. So it sounds as though it's in perpetuity. So a developer does a development, he's required to give that lot over to the government or to a corporate body. But 50 years down the line, he's still supposed to be providing money for the maintenance of that lot. And something has to be wrong with that. First of all, this legislation is compulsory taking the land without compensation, and is also imposing this requirement. So I think that needs again to be looked at, and I suggest a little tidying up there would be necessary. And just finally, I would also commend the government on the introduction or embedding into this legislation the requirements for the building code. That is something that has been bandied around and talked about for some time. And so it's now here. Of course, as was observed, I think earlier, there's really no building code at the moment. So I hope government will work assiduously to get that in place so that the act can function as it's required to. And with those few comments, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I first wish to open my comments, Mr. President, by saying that I never thought that I would, from the floor of this House or in any other place, disagree with our Prime Minister. But our Prime Minister has said on more than one occasion that there is no magic wand and that we do all these things in a reasonable time and that these things are not going to happen overnight. It will take time. But I wish to disagree with her only insofar as we have already had 27 sittings of the other place, and we are at 16, 17 of this place. And the pace of legislation that has come through both places has been so blistering that we seem to have created the impression that there actually is a magic wand to policymaking, Mr. President. We seem to have given the impression that these things actually do happen overnight. But that is not really so true. That is not so, Mr. President. We seem to have given the impression that even though we have brought a number of items of legislation that treat to the broad legislative and policy agenda of the administration, that it all gets done overnight. And I want to start there, Mr. President, because I have heard on this occasion and on other occasions calls for the government to take a broad view of one thing or the other. And I wish to assure the members of this House and the members of the public who listen to us that the government of Barbados, this administration, is doing just that. But it really has been 8 months, Mr. President. and the pace at which this government has already started to undertake this body of work has been commendable. And I wish to take this opportunity to commend the government of Barbados for having already bitten off a bite-sized chunk of a very large apple and to begin to go through the process. Mr. President, I have two main substantive points that I want to make on this legislation. And I want to treat in my submission to both the goals of the legislation, what it sets out to accomplish, and I want to treat to the dual obligations of the government of this country. Now, it is very easy, Mr. President, for those who have responsibility to no one or to nothing. I'm using the words being paraphrased from a regional leader in a different space just last week. And he said, it is easy for those of you who have no responsibility to anyone or anything to stand up and shout and say all kinds of things that may seem convenient at the moment. Those things, especially when the press is in the room, that sound as though the more inflammatory they will be, the bigger the headline could possibly be. And so we do those things because we have no responsibility to no one or to nothing. But the government of Barbados has a responsibility to those who elected it. And the government of Barbados has a responsibility to ensure that in developing bodies of legislation, there is no single consideration. And I wish, therefore, to start with the assertion that the government of Barbados would be in a place where it sought to take bread from the mouths of those who have made a livelihood on building dwelling places, whether private for families or for commercial purposes. Mr. President, Section 44.3 of this legislation was not designed for that purpose. It was not designed to prohibit those known in the legislation or known anecdotally as architectural technologists to not be able to do any work. That was not the purpose. Mr. President, I want to use the example of a tertiary level institution that I'm a little familiar with, just a little, where we have come under significant pressure over many years on the question of accreditation. In order for a person to be certified and recognized by certain international entities as being a registered architect or engineer, they have to have graduated from a tertiary level institution with a minimum of 4 years education. They would have had to practice for a further year under the supervision of a supervisory body, after which they have to register on an annual basis, Mr. President. That is the requirement met from the tertiary level institutions and then delegated in authority by the registration boards in the domestic space. Mr. President, the specific name that we're referring to here is in Cap 373, the Profession, Trade, and Business Registration, and I wish to draw attention of this place to the first schedule in particular, Mr. President. The first schedule identifies a number of professionals that are called attorney at law, attorney other than SC or QC, medical practitioner, accountant, actuary, architect, this is the one in particular, dental practitioner, engineer, land surveyor, quantity surveyor, and veterinary surgeon. And in all those instances, Mr. President, those professions are then represented in Part 2 of the schedule with specific legislation governing their action. We were asked here today about exclusion of certain categories of workers from the legislation. And those workers those professionals are captured in the second schedule of the legislation. The second schedule, however, is not accompanied by any supporting regulatory body. I think Senator Tate may have raised it earlier. It is not supported by any regulatory body. It is not supported by any oversight. And except for the provisions that are contained within the building code and the relevant ancillary legislation, there are no regulatory bodies with the kind of oversight in the same way that Schedule 1 professions have them. And so it is a responsibility of the government of Barbados to ensure that there are those that have livelihoods, yes, but it is equally the responsibility, Mr. President, of the government of Barbados to protect the end users of our services provided by those professionals and the consumers. And it is for that reason, Mr. President, that the government of Barbados sought to create balance. We sought to create an approach that accommodated multiple interests. This is not a time where we want people to not work, and the Barbados Association of Architectural Technologists made strong representation to the government of Barbados, which we listened to, and is then reflected in the amendment to this legislation to allow, at Articles 44, Section 44, Subsection 3, for there to be buildings designed by persons other than those captured in the Professionals Act as architects or engineers, and they are therefore enabled. And there are restrictions because there is that balance. There is that question of balance. And I want to take this opportunity on the floor, Mr. President, to always remind us that there is no such thing as a single lens. There is no single view. In all things and at all times and in all circumstances, we must take a multidimensional approach. And so the interests of one sector cannot supersede at the expense of everything else. And that is not the responsibility that the government of Barbados can carry. We have to be responsible also to consumers. And there's a rationale for that also raised by Senator Tate. And it is the question of liability. Under the existing regulations, that which is already there, if a building is approved for construction by this government, responsible to all of its stakeholders, and it fails or in any way causes injury, the government, the Crown, would have been liable. It would have come to the state. Quite rightly, as said by Senator Tate, in instances where those professions covered under Schedule 1 and governed by the regulatory bodies, in instances where they fail, they hold the liability. Mr. President, that is the responsibility of a government, to ensure that multiple interests, no special interests, but multiple interests of all stakeholders, users and end users. And it is for that reason, Mr. President, that the process of consultation was all-encompassing. The process of consultation began, Mr. President, on the 16th of July, 2018. It then continued on the 25th of July, 2018. The first consultation sought to involve the planners. It brought in the practitioners who are those who are applying the regulations for the system. And then the second consultation spoke to the end users. And it brought in the developers and all of those kinds of persons. Those consultations were streamed live using social media and using the Government Information Service. And over 9,000 viewers took the opportunity to follow those proceedings. Those viewers and those that were present were invited thereafter, Mr. President, and I think I'm taking the time to go through this because I do not want the impression to go out in the press, because it happens often. He who shouts most and loudest doesn't always have to be correct, but that is what is represented in the public space. So it is important, with sober minds and sober heads and level tongues, to be able to speak that which is true. 9,000 viewers, in addition to those that were present between the two consultations, followed those consultations between July. They then went on to set up a dedicated email address at which they could receive submissions from the public. Subsequent consultations were held thereafter, and public engagements were held where there was a sensitization process based on those outcomes. The submissions were then cumulated and circulated to those persons who took the time to make submissions. There was one group that felt that the circulation triggered for them a concern about how the legislation treated to their subsector. And we are seeing before us an amendment that sought to accommodate that. That is how a responsible government that is responsible for itself and for the nation conducts itself. We held further consultations as recently as last week. Submissions were made by a number of people, and I want to list some of them. because I don't see any friends and family in here. I see the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers. I see the Barbados Institute of Architects. I even see the Barbados Sea Turtle Project, who wanted to take the time to come and speak on how to manage our coastal areas. They took the time to make a submission, Mr. President. There were private individuals who in their own right had an interest in the legislation. Developers who were concerned about how their operations, retail and construction operations, would then be impacted on by the legislation. You even had renewable energy professionals who came, and you had our major electricity company, Barbados Light and Power, in addition to a range of private persons who not just came and listened, but took the time to submit. So it is a misrepresentation of the truth at best and farcical at worst to suggest that there was not a period of consultation as it relates to this legislation. That is not the message we want to send out to the public. In addition to that, Mr. President, it is also a misrepresentation of the truth to say that this government would seek to take bread out of the mouths of anybody. We do not do that, but we also don't put consumers, end users, at risk by ensuring that there are no, by making the effort from our side to ensure that regulations are in place. Because the same people who would have a lot to say when you don't put regulations in place will be the same ones who will jump up first and crucify you when there are consequences for the absence of those provisions. We have to keep a sober head, Mr. President, and we have done so. I want to go back to the importance of the legislation and what it seeks to do. Mr. President, I've come to learn, I'm not as learned as some of my colleagues. I'm not as experienced as some of my colleagues, but I do the best that I can, Mr. President. But in the short time, relatively, that I've been around, I've learned to be very careful, very cautious of any sentence that begins with "all you have to do is." It is usually an indication of an oversimplification. It is usually an indication of a failure to study with any depth. It is usually an indication of a failure to be multidimensional and multifaceted. There is no such thing, Mr. President, as all you have to do, because life in all of its parts is always, at all times, far more complex than just that. And if there was such a thing as all you have to do, this country, any country, would never have a single problem in the world, if that were true. But we know it is not. So, Mr. President, we're talking about the construction industry. Up to 2012, the construction industry contributed more overall than both the traded and the non-tradable sectors combined. It accounted for about 22.3% of annual GDP. In 2016, we had a raft of hotel construction, and the sector grew by a further 6.3%. But in 2018, without any significant private construction activity, and all this information is drawn from the central bank reports on an annual basis, it contracted in the first 9 months of the year. There is a run-on effect from construction activity that is multifaceted. We're talking about employment, yes. We're talking about livelihoods, yes. We're talking about building construction, yes. We're talking about coastal preservation, yes. But overall, what this new legislation seeks to do by naming it the Sustainable Development Board, you're talking about the fourth goal of the bill, which is sustainable development. You're talking about sustainable development in its literal sense, development for today in a way that provides for generations of the future. That is what sustainable development is defined as, and that is what this bill seeks to do. I want to take a moment to say why that is important. Because, Mr. President, Barbados has always taken a leadership role, starting in 1992, in sustainable development issues. Many of us are very familiar with the Barbados Plan of Action and all of the succession plans that followed thereafter. And so it is perfectly fitting that a government of Barbados would then undertake to develop land use policies in such a way that ensures that its multidimensional approach to development today enables it to plan for future generations. And so while attention has been paid to issues like land use, waste disposal, and the general management of our general environment, I wish to draw one aspect of this that needs to be brought into the conversation, not necessarily by the government, but by industry into the conversation. I wish to speak about our professionals. Now, Mr. President, many of the professionals that have come to make submissions on this legislation represent our building community. The industry in large developing countries, and right here in the region, in the Bahamas, in Cayman, in the Dominican Republic, in Trinidad and Tobago, they have established what we now know as green building councils. And they have sought as an industry, not just to advocate and lobby for building codes, land use policies, reform of building acts. They have not just done that. They have sought to create industry-based standards that treat to the preservation of the environment using the principles of sustainable development. They developed over time, along with industries all around the world, especially in larger economies, something called a Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design certification process, where industries all around the world operating in and around in construction have developed about 7 training modules. 1, you're a green associate. You must be an engineer, an architect, or any of those professionals captured in schedules 1 or 2. And you then go on to use your basic construction principles to understand how to position a property to ensure that a hurricane zone, in a hurricane zone, you can mitigate the impact. Sea level rise, climate change, those kinds of things. They went further and they have a leadership in advanced professional, which measures knowledge about green building. They deal with building design and construction, operations and maintenance, even interiors, neighborhood development, and then overall homes. There is an opportunity for Barbados to develop an entirely new sector of professionals to service this new development planning process, to service the new thrust for sustainable development through our land development planning process. There is an opportunity for Barbados also to be able to export the skills developed by these professionals so that they too can work in other small island developing states facing the same issues that we are. Mr. President, I wish to use this opportunity and my platform here to call on my colleagues in the private sector and in industry to be able to develop their own standards, to be able to develop a cadre of persons who are now capable of building not using traditional techniques, but to expand the scope of those who are already skilled and trained in things like LEED, to be able to go even further. Because there is an opportunity for Barbados to be able, at the construction level, at the development level, at the community planning level, to go even further than we as a government have envisaged. And I want to encourage them to use their platform for lobbying, for more than self-preservation, but to use the platform for lobbying to be able to spur the process of development into new and advanced spaces that we have not yet gone before. And I don't want to say much more beyond that, but I want to respond only to a point made by Senator Nurse. Senator Nurse spoke in his submission about the board, and he was making the point about the board being subject to the minister. And trying to find where I have it now. I had it here open for me. Right, the board being subject to the minister and the minister taking the time. The minister taking the time to effectively be the one who is dealing with all of the decision-making process. And I wasn't certain if that meant that there was a lack of clarity in Senator Nurse's understanding of how the board is meant to operate. But the board has very clear parameters on how it is meant to function. And when it says, Senator Nurse says, the minister is not, we need technical people, people who understand the technical issues. The board, it says here in the legislation, the board shall consist of the chief town planner and 12 persons appointed in accordance with this section. A chairperson, not a government person. B, 4 ex officio members who are all technical. Chief technical officer in the ministry responsible for public works, the chief technical officer in the ministry responsible for agriculture, the director of the coastal zone management unit, and the director for the department responsible for environmental protection. It then goes on to speak to the question of heritage. 1 member appointed by the minister on the recommendation of the Barbados National Trust. It goes on further. It says 2 members appointed by the minister after consultation with the professional bodies, and it specifies what those technical people should be, representing professional land use planners, architects, engineers, and land surveyors. And then finally, 4 members appointed by the minister drawn from, very specific, legal profession, financial institutions, the private business sector, academia, or non-governmental organizations, having knowledge and experience of matters relevant to land development. So I would not wish it to go out into the public space that a board of random persons with no technical expertise is being constituted under the parameters of this legislation to advise the minister who herself or himself knows nothing about land planning, but in fact, they are specifically in the legislation defined as technicians. And with those few words, Mr. President, I wish to thank you for the opportunity, and I wish to join my colleagues in supporting this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank all honorable senators for who participated in this debate. I knew, as I said at the beginning, I knew it would be fairly technical, but from their comments, I recognize that most of them, if not all of them, seem to be in support in the need to modernize this legislation and to proceed with this bill, and certainly to support the bill. I said not all. First of all, Senator Franklin made the comment that in somehow he spoke to his usual mantra about legislation being rushed. I first of all want to tell him through you, Mr. President, if I may, that there's no such thing as a perfect bill. I believe it was Senator Nurse who also alluded to that. And if we were to wait eternally, or if we were to wait for the presentation of that perfect bill, perhaps we'll wait for eternity. He, however, said that it was being rushed because of the IMF specification, or an IMF dictated, or implied, or insinuated that perhaps insinuated. Mr. President, I was my understanding of what he said. I am no lawyer, I'm not legally trained like the honorable member, sir. I just want to draw for his benefit and for that of his colleague to his immediate right. Page 51 of the last BLP manifesto, Building the Best Barbados Together. I know that Senator Franklin Adore is the person on the cover of that manifesto. And it says on page 51, under our physical development, transparent and efficient processes, the BLP will modernize our approach to physical development planning. There was no IMF discussion at this time. This was May 2018. We will convene within our first month in office a mission-critical team to review the Town and Country Planning Act and related regulations, development planning and controls, including the active use of planning gains, etc. The team will be mandated to make urgent recommendations to the Cabinet on ways to streamline and expedite the planning process. You had your consultations, you had your green paper. We will make the development control process transparent and accountable by providing, and it goes on to list the issue of providing for neighbors and other interested parties to comment, introduce public hearings, etc., etc. and it spoke to that in detail. I believe the honourable member, Mr. President, will be well served in reading this document before he plans the manifesto for the PPD or FDD or whatever it is, which is the institution of the organization. I almost said, Mr. President, I almost said racketeers, but I knew it would be unparliamentary. Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. President, I'm hearing a size which I shouldn't hear, that the leader of that grouping, the PPFDD, in the other place supported this resignation. I believe, Mr. President, one letter is missing from between the two P's, but I am not at liberty to say. Senator Driggs, and I'm sorry I wasn't here for her presentation. She usually makes very interesting and useful presentations, but unfortunately I was at a meeting outside of this chamber. And she spoke, I'm told, about the physical development plan being part of an economic growth and sustainable development plan. Yes, it is, and it is certainly, there's already a physical development plan in place, which is available on the website at the Town and Country Planning. But certainly the government will be looking at that in terms of working to tweak and to redefine and come up with its own physical development plan. And it will be part of this growth and development plan that you speak of. Certainly, I agree with you. The bill is aimed at promoting growth and investment, and I look forward to your support for the bill. Senator Maynard raised the issue of the time frame, and I believe Senator Nurse also alluded to it, in that they had concerns at the time when we expected a technical report expired, that the bill was allowing the department to proceed. And I note the concern. All I can say that government doesn't necessarily work like this. Certainly if you were in the 12 acres in St. John, contemplating doing a hotel development in the Scotland district, that in terms of sewage, and if you required, for instance, packet treatment sewage treatment plant, and there were some technical specifications that were required, and it wasn't done in time. I don't believe that the Town and Country Planning Department will rush off and give you permission without having seen the report in terms of the effect it might have on the Scotland district. So I want to assure members, I note their concern. It will certainly be discussed, but I am not of the opinion, Mr. President, that government functions like that. I don't think that government is reckless. I don't believe that the public servants, the hard-working public servants are like that. The issue of the grid and the being part of the grid, we discussed, Mr. President, the honorable member discussed this with me, and I said when I was reading the bill last night, it came across my mind also, and this is no secret. I read it in its entirety. I wish I could say so, Mr. President, for the honorable leader of the opposition in this chamber. But it dawned on me also that we're speaking about green economy and stuff like that, and what we hope to achieve by 2030. And I wasn't seeing in terms of requirements in that direction. And as I said, Mr. President, I am hopeful, and I'm based on the legislation, certainly in terms of development, it can be included as one of those obligations that you could ask in terms of using houses that are not on grid, etc., and certainly other things as we aim to make Barbados at least carbon neutral. The issue of Clause 48.3 and the developer who opts to transfer the open space to the Crown. I spoke to this early in terms, again, of obligations and the need for developers to, in the areas, have open areas for recreation. I know that the honourable member, the honourable senator, would be familiar with chronic diseases and the need for persons to exercise. And there's a feeling in Barbados that we've ran hard previously in terms of development before taking into consideration the need for open spaces, green spaces. And in the bill, under 48B, a body corporate that is representative of the owners of the building lots in the subdivision. And the onus is on the developer to ensure that whenever he's doing his transfers or his sales, to ensure to make the persons who are purchasing the lots, that this will be their responsibility. I believe an honorable member who sat in this chamber last year lives in a certain part of St. Thomas that the honorable member Franklin finds difficulty in traveling through, own a lot at the end of her. And she barricaded the open area and certainly maintained it. So this is something that obtains in her. And an honorable senator has already obtained in Barbados. And I'm sure that the persons who buy the lots, who purchase the lots, would have no difficulty as a community in looking after this. So it's the onus is on the developer to ensure that. Senator Boyce, again, I missed your presentation. You raised the concerns of implementation. That is obviously something that will have to be addressed and government will have to monitor. Obviously, the necessary resources and adequate resources will have to be put in place, especially as it relates to the use of information technology. And I agree with your point in terms of the register. In terms of getting a certificate. In terms of 44.1 versus 44.3, I believe this was an issue in terms of both Senator Boyce, Mr. President, and Senator Tate. One of the men, she was in the chamber for a few minutes. As in 44.1, it speaks to a registered professional architect or civil engineer, and the point that in 3 they just said an engineer. 44.2, sorry. I note the point, and in the definitions they speak in the same bill of person being registered. But the point is certainly taken in terms of the civil engineers, there are electrical engineers which might be involved in this project. So it is something that will have to be looked at in terms of addressing it. The point of the definitions, the no definition of use class order. I am told that the use class encompasses the uses, residential, office, etc. That is what you call this, meant by the use class order. Senator Tate. I know Senator Tate supports the need for draftsmen to be registered. And in terms of having their responsibility, she spoke strongly to that and stridently for the need for draftsmen to be registered. And I know that this is an issue between the draftsmen and the architects. And as Senator Cummins said, that in terms of the consultative process, the government was trying to accommodate all types and not focusing on one set, as the Honorable Senator Franklin said, that they were focusing on their friends. I know that he would not mean in terms of the draftsmen. I thought perhaps I was misguided that he was referring to in terms of the registrable professionals at this time, but obviously I misunderstood him. And he recognized that the government is indeed catering to those less privileged, like the draftsmen who are not registered currently and have no means of being registered, and ensuring that they get a piece of the pie. In terms of Senator Tate, in the issue of is it you want to be clear if it is less than 10 units or more than 10 units or 10 units, it is what it says in the bill. And that is clear, but less than 10 dwelling units. So up to 10, but not 10. Clearly 9. Mr. President, I am looking at the bill. It is clear, Mr. President, it says buildings of not more than 2 stories containing more than 2 dwelling units, but less than 10 dwelling units. What is less than 10? 1 to 9, Mr. President, so that they'll be allowed to do that. I don't know what was the difficulty, but the Prime Minister is not mentioned in the bill, Mr. President. Senator Nurse generally supported the bill, but then he spoke in terms of his concerns regarding he didn't use the descriptive terms that were used by Senator Franklin in terms of what he saw was taking away the power of the chieftain planner. He said that the chieftain planner was now reduced to a mere executive secretary. I believe that was what he said. And I was looking for something to say. As far as I can see in the bill, there shall be a department of government to be known as a Plan Development Department, headed by a chieftain planner, who shall be a public officer. And it went on to state his responsibilities in terms of the planning officers and the responsibility of the staff. And the chieftain planner interiorly would prepare and cause prepared physical development plans. He'd be working with that with his staff, reviewing and evaluating all applications submitted under Part 4 of this Act. He and his staff would be reviewing documents submitted in support of applications. Excuse me. Make recommendations to the board or the ministers with respect to the exercise of their power to determine applications for planning permission. So he has an input into the minister directly. Carry out inspections for the purpose of detecting and initiating enforcement action, issuing notices, providing the minister or the board such data reports, etc. And then his duties with the board specifically. The Honorable Senator mentioned the composition of the board. He thought, and this is in all of the OECS countries, the hybrid system is used in several other Caribbean countries. There's always the bone of contention of the chieftain planner should be the executive secretary or the CEO. In some cases, the person is the CEO. In other cases, it is the executive secretary. But his points have been noted. And as I said, the issues in terms of 48.3 was addressed earlier. Mr. President, I believe I've covered the comments and I've noted the seriousness brought to the debate. Senator Rogers spoke about the preservation of heritage, and he spoke about the age of the Anglican churches, and perhaps he should have mentioned the work of the slaves in that respect and the very good work that they would have done in constructing and building those buildings decades ago. I know his concerns were also, he recognized that some of his concerns were addressed, but I take his point as being very important. We have lost too many of these buildings in Barbados. We've not paid enough attention, and there's certainly time that they'd be addressed. In terms of the funding of the processes for this, I believe there's a lot of work for the National Trust of Barbados to be involved in. And certainly Anglican churches recognize that it can look after its own buildings. Although St. Joseph Church in St. Joseph, I believe, is one that obviously needs, I don't know, that might be considered an emergency. I believe there's some structural problems there specifically. So these are some of the things that we have to take into consideration. But I take his point and I accept his suggestions. Mr. President, with those few words, I want to beg that this bill be now read a second time.
Consideration be now read a second time. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have.
Mr. President, I beg that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the House resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
Question is that I do now leave the chair. The House and Senate resolve itself into committee for the further detailed consideration of this bill. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Federal call the clauses.
House is known.
Might have to changes today.
The House is now in committee.
Part 1, clauses 1 to 3.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 to 3 stand part.
The question is that Part 1, clauses 1 to 3 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 4 to 11.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 2, clauses 4 to 11 stand part.
Senator Franklin?
Yes, sir. I don't mean to nitpick, sir, but clause 6.13 does not make sense. I didn't vote against the bill, so I want but they said that I sit down and allow submit this nonsense to pass.
What is the particular?
6.13.
The first in proper form, I think, should be out. And it should just be minutes of each meeting. Shall be taken in proper form.
I don't know. Just don't go right.
So this will be amended.
Minutes of each meeting shall be taken in proper form and kept. Take out the first proper form.
The first proper form.
In proper form.
Will be out.
I don't know if the honorable member is agreeable to that. It's a typo. You can't embarrass me by bringing it back.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 4 to 11 stand part.
As amended.
As amended. Honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I don't know if you will call that an amendment, though.
It's a typo.
Is it? Yeah.
A correction. Correction.
Oh, if you say amendment, you have to go back to the House.
As correct. Is it typo?
As corrected, stand part.
Corrected.
It's a typo. It's just a typo. Honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 12 to 19.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 3, clauses 12 to 19 stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 12 to 19 stand part. Honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 20 to 43.
43.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 4, clauses 20 to 43 stand part.
The question is that Part 4, clauses 20 to 43 stand part. Honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 44 to 51.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 44 to 51 stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 44 to 51 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Deputy President, I'm just wondering in this area, this clause where, clause 44, where there was a question as to the type of engineer we're referring to, how we're going to address that for purposes of this process. I believe that the leader of government business did agree that it needs to be clarified in as much as the clause 44.1.3.1 had an insertion of the word civil. So I'm just querying how we propose to address that. Is it right through? Are we calling them all civil? Are we calling some structural? Are we calling some if we can get clarification so that we can proceed with the vote. We don't want to keep it back, but for purposes of clarity, it's important that that is sorted out. Sir.
I think they have put in civil. I think it's amended to put the civil in.
Fair George. This amendment was made on 6. You said it was put. Insert the word civil before the word engineer. It was amended to put in.
Yes, but there were other civil engineers mentioned in the rest of the clause. So that's what I mean. Not just that clause that has civil, I mean an engineer reference.
They put in civil.
There's 44.3.
You see here, they amended it downstairs to put in civil engineer. When they came back down here, they only have engineer.
Engineer. That should be civil.
Civil. You should add in civil, yeah?
Mr. Chair.
This they added in civil before.
All the other engineers are civil.
But that's different. That's big. You had a shop there saying civil engineer. To run all the clauses, all the civil you can assume. But this is not a shop where this is 4401. You have just engineer.
Based on that discussion we had, reason that the engineer in the body references
that wherever you see engineer means
in 44. So have it inserted civil there, right? Have it inserted civil there, right? And not done it down here.
They're just saying that you're a civil engineer. Mr. Chairman, based on discussion with the clerk who sat in the other place, has explained to me that they've inserted civil engineer in 44.1. The expectation being that, having said civil engineer, that when they refer to engineer in this clause, they're speaking of civil engineers.
So does that mean you're putting it in?
Clause 41.
But Mr. Chairman, I believe when we also asked for clarification on the bill that we did, law reform, they stated this quite clearly in a number of cases where we queried that you had a title and then later on they referred, and they said they made a reference to the form and in terms of how they do these things. Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 5, Clauses 44 to 51 stand part.
The question is that Part 5, Clauses 44 to 51 stand part. Honorable Senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Who thinks the ayes have it?
Part 6, clauses 52 to 63.
52 to 63?
Yes, please.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 6, Clause 52 to 63 stand part.
Mr. Chair, just a quick note, 62.5, sorry, Lord, 62.2F. There's a typo, obviously. but it should be
62.2F.
62.2F, clerk of the court to whom, page 81, clerk of the court to whom, and the address at which
Paid.
or to which, yeah.
Paid instead of paying?
Paid, yes, sir.
It's a typo, Mr. Should be paid instead of paying.
What this typo is. The question is,
Okay.
yeah, I see. Must be there. Yeah. N instead of a, that N instead of a D. Typo again.
D instead of.
Yeah. Part. Question is then that part 6. Clauses 52 to 63 stand part. As corrected. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 7, clauses 64 to 68.
Chairman, I beg to move that part 7, clauses 64 to 68 stand part.
The question is that part 7, clauses 64 to 68 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
I think I know everything. I don't.
This is not resolution for town planning, that's not resolution for traffic.
Mr. Chairman, as I understand it, this is the minister can make regulations, and if I refer the honorable member to clause 105 over the page, and it goes on to say that the minister may, by order subject to negative resolution, amend the first, second, and third schedules to this act.
I understand that 105, but you amended the schedules. But I was asking about the other regulations. The schedules are already made.
Minister? The minister responsible for transport and works can make regulations with the Tongue Planning Act, not Tongue Planning, Road Traffic Act. Minister makes
Publishing the official gazette, even when they're blocking off the road for Kadooment or.
All right, so let's go. The question is that part 12 clauses 95 to 110 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
First schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Second schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Third schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill.
The question is that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Fourth schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the fourth schedule be the fourth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the fourth schedule be the fourth schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Report.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you will now report to His Honor the President the passing of $1 billion committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of $1 billion committee. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Chairman has reported to me the passage of $1 billion committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill under consideration be now read a third time. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Planning and Development Act 2019.
Question is that the bill do now pass and be so cited. All honorable members in favor, please say aye.
That's correct. Sorry, Mr. President. As corrected.
Question is that the bill do now pass as corrected and be so cited. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this sitting be suspended for 15 minutes.
The question is that this sitting be now suspended for 15 minutes. This brings us to 6:30. End of the suspension, 6:30. All honorable members in favor? Sorry.
I said last week, 6:30.
6:35. We amended by 5 minutes and we'll be suspended until 6:35. Thank you.